In a dark cave, a young man sat in shock and repeated that what had happened to him would be the end of him. His palms were clutching his blood-red forearm, and his thoughts were spinning around death because he didn't know whether he would go to hell or heaven. He was sitting on a flat rock, and in front of him was a virtual neon yellow sign offering to see the end of this world, while the guy himself was still thinking about hell and heaven and what the creatures in hell thought about heaven. The sign that said he was going to see the end of this world continued to hang motionless in the air in front of his face. The boy looked down at her and then back again, continuing to wonder what he would see and whether he would see the end. He leaned back against the stone, exhausted, closing his eyes from fatigue and falling into memories. His name was Kyle, and he was being asked about Becca, who was his sister, and someone's adult voice was advising them to rest, since it was a long way to go home, while Kyle himself was sitting in the back seat of the car and carefully holding his little sister's head. The bright light from an oncoming car suddenly illuminated the entire interior of their car. Kyle came to his senses in the same cave on a flat stone, realizing that it was several years ago, because when he woke up, he was already in this cave, and there was some kind of book nearby in the purple light. The book was called The Celestial Harmony of Pure Art, and that was the only thing Kyle got there. He took this book because it was the last clue to get back home, and it had a single message telling him that he needed to see the end of this world. And Kyle didn't know if he would be able to return to his family if he followed this instruction. When his strength and endurance were running low, a new neon sign announced that he had completed his training. Tired and exhausted, Kyle was surprised by this news. All this time he remained in the cave, tormented by sad thoughts. So the bright light of freedom struck him, because he could not believe that it was all over, and he would be able to see his parents and sister Becca. Kyle walked out of the cave towards the light and immediately fell to his knees in disappointment. He was not at home. He was not in his home world, and the place outside the cave turned out to be another world of martial arts called Murim. Kyle hit the ground with his fists in disappointment and anger because he had hoped that by leaving the cave he would get home, but he found himself only at the beginning of another long journey. The guy couldn't understand why someone he didn't know was doing this to him, since he had been in the cave for at least 10 years. Kyle stared into space in front of him, wondering what he would have to do to see the end of the world. Suddenly a stranger called out to him, saying that he had a nice outfit, and that Kyle had been making so much noise that the man had heard him. The man said that he would not have done anything to Kyle without reason, but his family was now starving. The stranger was ecstatic, looked shabby and resembled a bandit, pointing a sword and threatening with the question of whether the guy would become their food. Kyle was shocked by this situation, because he still hadn't recovered from leaving the cave. The bloody sword fell to the ground with a dull sound. Kyle backed away from the dead stranger, whose body lay lifeless on the ground. He was sure that it wasn't his fault, not understanding why everything turned out this way, and a lot of thoughts about how he killed a person for the first time, that it was the only way out, and he had no choice, as well as the fact that he couldn't do anything else, with doubts about how anyone would do it, and he didn't know what to do because a stranger attacked him, and Kyle was not sure if this was not a dream, and whether he really became a killer. A neon yellow sign suddenly appeared in front of him, informing him that Kyle's external level had increased. The guy hesitantly stood up, stopping near the corpse and thinking that apparently he really did kill someone, and this led to an increase in his level. The first nervous chuckles escaped his mouth as he came to his senses. Through laughter, nervous tension was released, and it became easier to accept the surrounding reality, because this message allowed him to intuitively understand what needed to be done. That book, The Celestial Harmony of Pure Art, taught him everything. And the levels that were written about there, increasing with each kill, they should help Kyle return to his original world, which means he needs to reach the maximum level. Therefore, in the present time, Kyle has become an invincible warrior, inviting the enemy to demonstrate his skills in another fight. He threatened the head of the demonic sect with his sword, while his assistants tried to somehow change the losing situation. Now in this world, Kyle was called the Immortal Sword Emperor, and he couldn't remember which sect leader was in front of him. The leader of the demonic sect claimed that he was also an Immortal Sword Emperor, but Kyle looked at his clothes and realized that he was the 8th head of the sect. The guy began to count on his fingers how many previous leaders of this sect had died at his hands, and it turned out that it was already 6. Kyle said out loud with a carefree smile that the guys from this cult were strange because he met them every 10 years. However, his carelessness was deceptive, because in just an instant he was able to summon his sword and his magical power, which illuminated his face with a blue light. 1 second was enough for Kyle to cut off the head of another leader of the demonic sect with one blow of his sword, and the guy himself said that, overall, it was fun for him to meet them again. The same cult acolyte who had tried to help his leader at the very beginning once again jumped on Kyle with a sword, shouting that he would avenge his master by killing the demon-like bastard he considered Kyle to be. Kyle easily dodged the blow, asking if the acolyte was serious and if he was really a member of the demonic sect too. The guy easily caught the stranger's face with his palm, because he had unlimited strength. Using his magic to fill the surrounding area with blue light, Kyle said that he liked the fighting spirit of this acolyte. He couldn't object, because due to Kyle's magic, his body stopped obeying its owner. But Kyle didn't stop there, as his magic created an entire wall that divided the world around them into two parts with a large border. And behind this wall, the novice saw not that simple smiling guy Kyle, but an otherworldly demon with a frightening face, surrounded by blood. Just a moment later, Kyle released the boy, telling him that such fighting spirit was normal for his age, and that he should learn something new and come to Kyle again. He added that if he came back, it could cheer him up. Leaving the disciple alone in the gorge among the corpses, Kyle advised him that he should become the next head of the sect. In the evening, the guy threw his sword aside in disappointment, upset that the head of the sect he had killed during the day was a dud. He leaned against a tree, wondering out loud how he could now entertain himself in his life. He put his hands behind his head and thought about how maybe he should create a new sect himself, much stronger than the one he had defeated today, and wondered why everything had become so boring. Opening his eyes tiredly and looking at the sky, he thought about the time he had spent in this world. In the light of the full moon, he said out loud that a whole 140 years had passed since he had arrived here. 140 years since it all began. Since that car ride, the accident, and the fact that he was ready to see the end of this world for his family, but now he couldn't even remember their faces. If heaven did not exist for him, then this world became hell, and life day after day became hellish. But Kyle wasn't going to indulge in long reflections and sad thoughts about the past, because he remained alive in this strange world. Suddenly, his peace was disturbed by a new yellow board with new information. The first tablet said that his outer and inner levels were equal to 50, and this was the maximum to achieve, and therefore he was congratulated on this achievement. The second sign stated that Kyle had completed the unlock conditions, and in particular the final level, Heavenly Emergence, had been unlocked. But the most unexpected thing was the last sign, which said that Kyle would be returned to Earth. The boy had no words to express his emotions, except for the question of whether the return would happen now. More hysterical laughter was his first reaction, after which he admitted that he had already given up, and therefore, having received such permission to return, he must look pathetic. But the next thought made him come to his senses and fill with anger and madness, because such a proposal could also be an attempt to insult him. Kyle reached the maximum level, and after releasing his power, he asked the void if he could be considered a god, although it was a strange question on his part. He also believed that in order to become a god, he must cast aside all worldly desires. But when he thought about his family, his emotions were always running high, and he tried to figure out if he had ever felt like that in his life. Seeing the sign asking if he wanted to return to the original world, Kyle knew that his family had probably already died, because many years had passed, and he only wanted to return home because of them. But now he wanted only one thing: find the creature that drove him to this and take revenge on it. A huge desire for revenge and death for the one who was to blame for Kyle being here filled the guy. It didn't matter to him who was involved in this, or where he was. Kyle swore that he would definitely kill the one responsible for his presence in the alien world. All the guy's strength fell to the ground like one big avalanche. It was such a powerful release of magical energy that it could be seen from a great distance around. After all, the immortal Sword Emperor Kyle was finally ready to leave this world. He remained in the world for 140 years, raising his level and developing his abilities, so that in one instant, he could turn into a simple stream of information and be transported back to Earth, to his home world. On the day of Kyle's car accident with his parents in 2011, another event happened. The blonde girl, dressed in the robes of the goddess, and also accompanied by the obstacles of movement, knew more about this day than Kyle. After all, on that day a portal opened, and that day was supposed to bring horror that would threaten everyone very soon. And the goddess will do everything possible to ensure that humanity evolves to counter future threats, to stand against the horror that will come from the opening portals filled with many red eyes of huge monsters, because the goddess believes that people should not waste the blessing in vain. At this time, somewhere in another corner of the parallel world, someone's triumphant voice was heard in the silence. The chained man was glad that the alien path had finally begun, because he had waited so long for what happened, and he knew Kyle. In the real world, it was already the year 2025, and in Korea, in the dungeon of the Red Wolf, a girl, using magic, shot a bow. She shot at the huge red mutant wolves that were chasing the guy in the wasteland. The wolves were huge, had 4 eyes and huge fangs, and were intent on killing anyone in their path. But then the girl fired another arrow filled with blue glowing power using her archer skill, Power Arrow. And instead of hitting one wolf, the spell-filled arrow hit many of the creatures chasing the boy, allowing him to survive. The girl masterfully used her skills to deal with the monsters. And it was Kyle's sister, Becca, the leader of one of the groups of people fighting the monsters. She jumped down from the heights towards her rescued comrade, saying that it was not too late and they would be able to get out, while the rescued guy praised her skills. The guy was so distracted, forgetting about safety, and a huge wolf attacked him from behind, biting him fatally. Becca turned at the sound of the scream, surprised to see more wolves. The rescued man fell to the ground, quickly losing strength and life. The girl was left to watch as a huge pack of red wolves killed every person from her group before her eyes. She assessed the situation realistically, realizing that there were too many monsters and they weren't going to go anywhere, while her mana was slowly running out. She could also die if things continued at the same pace. But then she saw someone who, having barely run out into the clearing, immediately turned around and rushed into the forest. This was a young guy who clearly had no intention of helping his teammates and was going to save himself. Becca screamed his name, calling him Gray, hoping he would come to his senses. But her attempts were in vain. But she attracted the attention of the wolves, who immediately began to approach her. The girl tried to cast magic on the arrow, but her mana was spreading too slowly to use it quickly, and the situation was approaching the catastrophic point of failure. Meanwhile, Gray, with hysterical thoughts, ran from the clearing as fast as he could, realizing that he had been too reckless. As he watched his teammates being overtaken by the wolves, he mentally called them insects, thinking that he should never have joined their group, and if he lingered, the same fate would befall him. He saw a portal ahead, hoping that he could escape, as he had to do so. Becca was still able to fill her bow with power and release an arrow engulfed in blue flame. She stuck herself into the ground right in front of Gray's feet, preventing him from running any further. The girl immediately appeared behind him, addressing the disoriented guy. She was all engulfed in a blue flame of anger, calling Gray a damn dog and asking where he was going. The guy tried to act surprised, saying that he was glad that she, their leader, survived, and addressed her as mistress, while he began to justify himself that she had misunderstood the situation and they should all calm down. Becca, not listening to his chatter, simply grabbed the guy by the collar of his clothes. She was angry and repeated what she had already told Gray about the dangers of the battlefield. Becca was very angry, accusing Gray of being a weak coward who ran away in the face of danger, and their entire team died because of him. Gray just gritted his teeth in anger, openly saying that this was true, but he was not going to die here. At the same time, the guy pushed away Becky's hand that was holding him back, asking what difference it makes if he is a coward, since he is not obliged to sacrifice his life. Becca, not too surprised by his confession, laughed, saying that he was right. Turning away and about to leave him alone, she told herself that she shouldn't have expected more from Gray, because the guy was trash, and now he should have gone back to his father so that he could console the whiner and pat him on the head. But she doubted whether such a handsome father could turn a blind eye to his son's escape, and suggested that they watch what would happen to the Dawn organization, of which his father was the head. Becky's blackmail worked, making Gray very angry. The girl was about to go in the other direction when the guy called out to her. Gray was not going to let her go so easily because now she could ruin his reputation with her knowledge of his meanness. He activated the Rockbreaker fighter skill, concentrating his mana into red power to strike. A bolt of magic hit Becca, who didn't expect it, right in the chest. The force of his attack was so great that it sent her flying back several meters, causing her to drop her bow. With a cry of pain, Becca flew towards the distant tree, hitting the trunk hard. Gray stood frozen nearby, enjoying his victory over his defeated opponent. The angry guy grabbed her by the hair, angrily calling her names and pressuring her that no one needed her, because she didn't even have any relatives. Coming close to her face, the smug Gray mocked the girl, saying that even though she was strong and famous, she could not even imagine what would happen to her in his hands. The embittered coward intended to denigrate her by glorifying her, but in a bad sense with the help of his words. He intended to tell everyone that it was the leader Becca who had let everyone down and led to their deaths, and as a result of the raid into the dungeons, her entire group had died because of her. Gray concentrated the mana in his fist again, confirming with the girl that his story was quite plausible. Becca didn't have the strength or energy to respond to the traitor. Gray swung his arm to finish her off with a final word about how well the leader Becca had done. Lightning bolts of blue magic lit up everything around them with a loud roar, splitting the skies and striking the ground behind the shocked Gray, distracting him and preventing him from finishing off Becca. In the swirl of dust and wind, a familiar dark silhouette appeared at the sight of the blue energy lightning strike. It was Kyle, finally transported to his homeworld. The boy looked exactly the same as he had in Murim, with long hair, loose clothes, and no trace of the age he had spent there. Two signs in front of his eyes informed him that he had reached the maximum outer and inner 50th levels, and that he had returned to Earth. Kyle slowly realized what had happened, beginning to rejoice that he was finally back. He started laughing hysterically again, thinking that returning to Earth was a reward for reaching the maximum level. It wasn't serious, as if everything that happened to him was some kind of joke. But despite such a joyful event, Kyle did not forget about his desire to kill the one who was guilty of his disappearance. His desire for revenge was as strong as it had been the first time he had thought of it. Gray, not understanding who was in front of him, called Kyle sick and said that he was talking to himself. Gray felt uneasy about someone suddenly appearing out of the thunder and screaming about murder. And if the stranger could teleport, then he was probably a mage. The traitor brazenly tried to appeal to Kyle, ordering him to tell where they were now. But Kyle ignored him, simply walking past him as if he were an unimportant bug. Gray was starting to get angry that the stranger was ignoring him, while Kyle noticed the girl who was unconscious. Kyle asked if Gray had a duel to the death with her, since she was dying. Gray didn't like this, because now there was one more extra witness. As Kyle leaned over the girl, the traitor realized his mistake. Gray realized that he had made the wrong choice again, because the stranger could see what had happened to Becca, which meant that he couldn't just let him go, but it would be better to get rid of him. The traitor tried to understand what the stranger was doing, but he was too afraid that he would understand what happened or find out the truth, so he activated his power again, filling his fist with red magic, and he didn't care what the stranger was doing, since he should just be eliminated as another obstacle. Gray called out to the stranger, but Kyle was busy examining the girl in front of him, including experiencing shock as he recognized her necklace. Kyle gently touched the girl's cheek, peering into her exhausted face. During this time, Gray lied that he and Becca were enjoying the fight to the death, and pretended to lie that he wished the gods would bring the girl back. But the traitor did not experience these feelings, but only distracted the stranger with conversation in order to reduce the distance. After all, he had already concentrated enough power to attack Kyle from behind, shouting that he would follow the girl to meet his death. Kyle's blue magic power gathered around him at that very second. Strong and energetic streams of blue magic stopped Gray. Kyle had too much control over his power, which was now all around them, closing them off from the outside world and suppressing everything around them. And the stranger's aura was frightening and deadly. Gray didn't expect such strength from his nondescript opponent. Kyle was too powerful and angry, and his raw power swirled the air around the boy floating above the ground. Gray could only watch everything around him in fear and amazement. Kyle, using his full power so that even his eyes glowed blue, asked if Gray knew who he was. Concentrating his powers into stable blue lightning, Kyle called Gray a young man, ordering him to state his name. But Gray didn't know him, so Kyle introduced himself, saying that he was the immortal Sword Emperor. He said his name, Kyle, and his power was so great that his eyes glowed with blue energy. The angry mage loomed over the frightened boy, telling him that even if he had named him, it would not have helped him. A small ball of bright neon blue light emitted from the finger that Kyle touched to the traitor's forehead. It was a charge of energy that in the next moment blew away everything in its path with a large and powerful beam, burning through space for many meters ahead, sparing neither stones nor trees. And from the outside, it was clear that the energy explosion born from the small ball reached colossal dimensions, leaving its mark for many meters around. When the energy of the blow was exhausted, only a charred spot remained of Gray's head, as well as behind it, along the trajectory of the blow. Remembering his name was very easy for Kyle, because he was in his homeworld. He stood behind the still unconscious girl, coming to his senses. Covered in blood and with a half-mad smile, Kyle informed her, addressing Becca by name, that her older brother had returned. Becca thought back to her childhood on that fateful day in 2011, when her parents told the upset girl, not for the first time, that it was time for them to leave and they couldn't stay where she wanted. And if Becca really wanted, she could be left alone. Her parents walked to the car, saying that it was getting dark and she should still go with them. Only her brother Kyle stayed by her side, asking if she really enjoyed the amusement park that much. He smiled, because he was worried about her, instructing her that if Becca still decided to stay in the park, then their parents could have big problems. Becca didn't want to agree with him, only hugging the bear tighter. She wanted to stay at the amusement park not because it was nice, but because if she went home, she didn't know when she would see her brother next, since her mom said that Kyle wouldn't be visiting them that often, since he was starting school. Kyle touched his sister's hair, calling her name to get her attention. He asked if Becca knew how much Kyle loved her, and then followed up by saying that even after school he would come and visit her. Becca listened with tears in her eyes to these words, and to the fact that Kyle suggested that next time they also go for a walk in this park to spend time together. She would never refuse Kyle, so she immediately pulled herself together and answered with a yes and a bright smile. So when Kai asked again if everything was okay and if she was ready to go home, Becca agreed and asked her brother to carry her to the car on his back to enjoy these moments fully. And Kyle replied that although he would carry her this time, he would not be able to do this every time because Becca was heavy, which caused his sister's feigned indignation, and she asked him to carry her every day. These were the last bright moments of her memories before the car accident that happened on the highway that same day. Becca blamed herself for the accident, thinking that it was because of her stubbornness and desire to go for a walk in the park, since their parents died in the accident. And when Becca came to in the wrecked car and called out to her brother, she received no answer. The place where Kyle had been sitting and wearing a seatbelt was empty because her brother was gone. In the real world, not the girl's memories, Kyle used his power to heal her. Becca came to with a scream, opening her eyes and taking a deep breath. She immediately tried to get up but felt pain, while Kyle informed her that he had healed her with spiritual power. But since the wound was deep, she would not be able to move painlessly right away. The girl looked at the guy with distrust and without a grain of recognition, asking who he was. To which Kyle, with a short pause, replied that he thought she would recognize him. The guy reached his hand towards her pendant, which she immediately grabbed and covered with her hand, while the stranger told her that he was happy to see her again, and that he had grown so much and had become much heavier since their last meeting. But that didn't stop Kyle, and he took Becca's hand with a smile, saying that he must have changed too. Becca was shocked by how much the stranger reminded her of him, her older brother from the bright memories of the past and the day of that terrible accident. After all, it was Kyle who gave her that pendant with a photo of their family and told her that even if he was not there, she should never give up and should always be strong. Becca swallowed her words, realizing who was standing in front of her. She started crying with happiness because her brother was such an idiot. He suddenly disappeared, and now he appeared. Kyle put his arms around his sobbing sister, holding her comfortingly, telling her that he understood how hard it was for her. But Becca came to her senses, pushing her brother away with a sharp movement and getting into a fighting stance, as she remembered that Gray should be somewhere nearby. Kyle turned serenely towards the crater where the body lay, asking if his sister was talking about this guy who tried to kill her. Becca was shocked to see both the crater and the corpse inside it. The body showed no signs of life and did not move. Becca asked Kyle why he killed Gray, and her brother, after confirming the traitor's death, asked what was wrong with the situation. The girl suddenly grabbed his hand, pulling him towards her. She spoke fearfully about how they needed to escape from here as quickly as possible. Becca lived in one of the high-rise buildings in an ordinary city in their previous apartment. While the girl sat on the sofa, her brother looked around, making sure that over the years the house had remained in the same condition as it was. Becca, meanwhile, was pondering the situation, informing her brother that they were in for a big problem, as Director Khan was due to arrive soon. Kyle didn't know who it was, so he asked his sister again, and she explained that it was the director of the Dawn Guild and also Gray's father, and since he was a local mafia member, he was known for his cruelty and ferocity. Director Kang was one of the 11 highest-ranking hunters in Korea. Becca looked at her watch, noticing that it had been a long time since she had been unconscious, and most likely Director Khan had already been informed of her son's death. She said out loud that she was the only one who survived that raid, which meant that she would definitely be suspected of something. Kyle couldn't understand why this could cause so much trouble. The guy asked with slight arrogance that since it was causing so many problems, why couldn't it be easier for him and his sister to just get rid of this group by killing their leader? Becca immediately brought Kyle down to earth with a familial slap on the cheeks, not allowing him to pompously say that he was the immortal emperor of the sword. Although the girl agreed that her brother's words made sense, she noted that Mr. Kan's level was higher than 50th, and he also held a fairly high position. And then Becca flared up, yelling at her brother for calling himself the immortal sword emperor, wondering who even said that, what it meant, and if her brother had been gone for 14 years and now he was saying that. Was he okay? Kyle was just surprised that she said it so bluntly, while the girl was complaining that she didn't know what to do because there was no father, mother, or brother nearby, and asked if Kyle understood how hard it was for her. She continued speaking, stopping at the fact that Kyle had appeared so unexpectedly when the guy himself froze in front of their family portrait. He upsetly clarified that her words meant that the parents had already died. Kyle asked his sister with some confusion if he had said something strange or if his tone had been too harsh, while the girl tried to understand what he was talking about. The boy reluctantly explained that he had been to a place called Murim, but the reason he had ended up there was not important to the conversation. Kyle turned to his sister, asking her to tell him everything that had happened while he was gone. He was interested in who the hunters were, what kind of guilds had appeared, and whether there was a concept of level in this world that she had mentioned. Becca stopped him, asking him to wait, as everything was too complicated to explain, and her head was threatening to explode from the amount of events happening. She stood up, getting ready to leave, saying goodbye that she would tell him everything later, since she had one urgent matter and needed to leave. Kyle asked where she was going, and Becca, showing the car keys, said that she was going to Dawn, asking Kyle to stay here and not do anything. Kyle walked away, opening the door and deciding to wait for her in his old room, where everything remained untouched, as if he had been there yesterday. The guy remembered his sister's indignant reaction to his words, realizing that he had been traveling alone for a long time and reaching the heights. And now he was about to become an older brother again, and it had been so long ago that he remembered almost nothing. Kyle was determined, remembering what his sister had said, including about Mr. Kane, and the boy decided that he should find out more about him. Then the sounds of bangs shook the front door, disturbing Kyle's peace. Several strangers were near the apartment with ill intentions. One of them used a magical purple seal, channeling his power through it. He grinned bloodthirstily, clearly planning a crime. So these three, with the help of the seal and the purple power, broke down the door to Becky's house. Kyle saw them from the hallway, hearing the question of where his sister was. The girl's older brother guessed who the guys were who smashed the door to their family's house. It was the group's director, Dawn Can, who was looking for Becca. At this time, the girl got to the business center in her car, where the second largest guild headquarters in Korea was located, the Dawn Guild. Becca was worried that she just walked away, leaving Kyle alone in the apartment. She hoped that Director Kang hadn't had time to do anything, and that he could grab her as soon as the girl entered the building. Wondering who to ask for help, Becca stood by her car when another girl called out her name. It was Alice Labora, the deputy head of the Dawn Guild, who was asking Becky what she was doing here. Becca asked the girl where the head of their guild was, and learned from her in response that Mr. Can had gone somewhere with the head of the raid, John. Alice asked the dejected Becky what had happened to her. Becca looked at the deputy guildmaster of Dawn thoughtfully and resolutely, mentally thinking about her position and status. Alice Libera was one of the 4 strongest hunters, and although everyone around her knew her strength, few understood it. Becca didn't think about it for long, because her situation was hopeless, and there was no one else to turn to for help. So she clenched her fists tighter, preparing to tell the girl in front of her the whole truth. At this time, 3 members of the Dawn Guild froze on the threshold of Becca and Kyle's house. Kyle was angry at the invaders for coming without warning. He asked if the most impressive thug among those who came was that very Khan, and whether his parents hadn't taught him to knock on doors instead of breaking them down, to which one of the guild mockingly clarified that maybe they should go out and then knock politely so that he would open the door, indignant that they hadn't come here for a housewarming party. The same impudent guy asked Becky's brother who he was, and Khan left the guy, pulling him up and forcing him to stop arguing. The guild leader said that nothing matters and that he only cares about where Becca is now. Kyle wasn't going to make things any easier for them by asking if they were really looking for Becca or the one who killed Gray. And if the latter, then he was the one who killed Khan's son, which left the guild leader in an angry shock. Mr. Can screamed in despair and anger, releasing his powerful red magical energy into the world around him. But Kyle was not embarrassed by this, and the guy said that since his title from Murim sounds so strange in this world, then he should be called Mr. Kyle Bennett by his family's last name, and since everyone understood everything, then they can begin, and activated his blue magical energy, concentrating it in his hands. The boy allowed Kanu to start as he wanted to see his skills, and the man concentrated all his power into the hammer to deal heavy damage to the impudent boy. They prepared for the clash, each using their accumulated energy, which in Khan's case was red and concentrated in a hammer that transformed into a sword, and in Kyle's case was blue and looked like lightning around his hand. Meanwhile, Alice, having heard from Becky the story of what happened during the raid, enthusiastically said that she wanted to see the girl's brother and that they should hurry. A fight was breaking out in the Benet house, and a sharp blast of red energy left a large, noticeable mark in the space. Khan unleashed his full force on Kyle with his blow, who was able to easily dodge the blow. The guy watched with interest that the Tao also had mysterious powers, and in this case they were similar to the spirit of the sword or its energy. Only Kyle saw that the source of these powers was different, wondering if this was the hunter power that his sister Becca had spoken of. The boy remembered how, at the moment he returned to this world, Gray, who attacked him, used the same strange power. Kyle found it funny and unusual, and he told himself that it was worth studying. Meanwhile, Lord Kan, overcome with anger and despair, prepared for a new blow, concentrating all his power into the sword. He swung his sword left and right, jumping towards the enemy and using his warrior skill called sequential attack. This allowed him to quickly and presumably unexpectedly approach Kyle. The guy just stood there and didn't move, completely unafraid of what was happening and not paying attention to the red flashes of magic. Kan swung his sword at him with concentrated force, intending to cut him in half. But nothing happened. The red magical energy did not cause any harm to Kyle, slowly dissipating around him. The guy told the embittered and futility-stricken Khan that it was enough, and Kyle saw everything to understand what the director of the Dawn Guild was capable of with his amazing and incomprehensible power. It turned out that the guy managed to block all of Khan's powerful attacks with his bare hands, and they didn't even push him away from his place. The guy was so strong. Kyle, with his blue eyes glowing from the magic he was using, ominously asked Mr. Kan if there really were 10 more people as strong as that one in Korea. At this time, Mr. Kan's assistants became active, preparing to attack Kyle from both sides, while he blocked their boss's sword with his hand. They tried to simultaneously unleash their attacks on Kyle, but were met with a blue glow that countered their attacks. The boy brushed them off like annoying flies, saying that they were just in his way, as another of the henchmen prepared fire seals to attack Kyle. The guy only had time to feel the heat from the fire directed at him. Several seals hit him directly in the back, exploding dangerously close in an attempt to damage and destroy him, because the owner of these seals, one of the minions of the guild leader, used a mage skill called fireballs. Director Khan and the others watched as the flames exploded right next to Kyle, and one of the henchmen cried out triumphantly that they had succeeded. Several more of the guild's henchmen rushed at Kyle's figure, which was blazing with magical fire, with swords, intending to pierce him through and through. Only now, Becky's brother, still engulfed in magical orange flame, once again stopped the blade aimed at him with his bare hands, in addition to reporting that the attackers had exceeded all his expectations. True, with the next phrase he doubted his words in anger, also easily breaking the attacker's sword, as if it was made of plastic. The guild's henchman's eyes widened in horror, as he had not expected this. Kyle activated his power again, which immediately engulfed his body in blue magical fire, dispelling the orange flames and throwing back the attackers. The minions couldn't understand why he was so strong and what he was doing at all. Kyle was simply shaking off his clothes, as if he was shaking off not the consequences of someone else's attack, but light dirt. He glanced briefly at the calendar, finding confirmation of his sister's words that he had only been gone 14 years, although he had been in Murim much longer. But now, when he assessed the abilities of the minions of the Dawn Guild who attacked him, he realized that their level was quite good, but their abilities were similar to innate talents that had been developed over the course of 1,000 years. And looking at the guild leader, Kyle did not understand how people were able to overtake Murim in 14 years, and such as the guild leader and his minions could only be found a couple of people in each generation, which was absurd and did not fit with reality. Kyle also remembered that he himself was a similar mismatch, as in Murim he had a low cultivation level, but he was much stronger than many. That is why he was able to defeat a huge number of opponents when he fought in Murim, and the reason was that the hierarchy of Murim's power did not affect him, and the power of those around him was just words for him. He then took advantage of the idea of rebuilding his abilities and becoming the pinnacle of power. So Kyle defeated everyone in Murim who was even the least bit interesting or dangerous to him. Alice and Becca hurried across the bridge to Benna's apartment. Becca herself, while driving, could not believe that the deputy head of a large guild wanted to see her brother. The girl glanced furtively at Alice, wondering why such an influential girl as Labora needed her unremarkable brother. And the difficult question remained whether Alice was their friend or enemy. Then, in the parking lot, Alice asked Becky for permission to meet her brother, Kyle Bennett, promising that in return she would report the incident with Gray as an accident. Libera also promised that she would talk to the guild director, and Becca thought that this was an excellent and generous offer that she shouldn't refuse. And now, when Becca is driving Mrs. Labora to her home, she thinks only about whether Alice is her brother's enemy or not, and does not understand why the girl in her car is silent. As if reading her mind, Alice Libera took up the words, reminding her that Becca had said that her brother Kyle had been missing, and asking how many years, to be exact, he had been missing. Becky's words confirming her brother's absence struck Alice with their timing, because Kyle had disappeared in 2011 and had been missing for 14 years. It seemed that Alice understood perfectly well where Becky's brother was, since she, like Kyle himself, translated 14 years into 140, which in reality passed in Murim, and Libra was even afraid to imagine in her mind how strong the guy would turn out to be. Therefore, the deputy head of the guild Dawn asked another question, asking Becky what kind of person her brother was, to which the girl hesitantly answered that he was sweet and kind, remembering his former self. Becca was pleased to talk about her brother, and she also noted that he was smart, and Alice asked if he had studied, meaning higher education institutions. Kyle's sister named the university where her brother studied and remembered that he also helped her with her homework, and Alice was surprised by the name because it was difficult to get in there, noting that the girl's brother probably studied very well. Becca just chuckled in response to this, saying that he was just very persistent, explaining that once Kyle took on something, he did it to the end, and did not stop until he reached the end. At this time, in the Bennett family's apartment, Kyle pointed his finger at another henchman of the Dawn Guild leader, standing at a short distance. Becca's brother, completely ignoring the swordsman who was furiously attacking from behind, asked the guy he pointed his finger at to use his strange aura again, because he had never seen such power in Murim. Having deflected the swordsman's attack from behind with one of his right hands, Kyle sternly asked not to interfere with him, since this attacker did not interest him. The guy Kyle had pointed at earlier had no choice but to activate his blue circular rune diagrams, which immediately produced ice crystals that he sent towards the stranger. Kyle repelled them with a simple shield, so that not a single shard of ice reached its target, and the guy himself commented that he liked the coldness of the minion who attacked him. And in Murim, such a one can only be found in the Ice Palace, which is on the North Sea. Remembering the ice dragon, Kyle brought his hand to his face, using magic to cause a fine frost to appear around his palm. In an instant, he turned this frost into huge ice dragons that were summoned to attack the guild minion who attacked him with ice crystals. The dim-witted Ice Lord was immediately frozen by the ice dragons, unable to withstand Kyle's power. The henchman with the shield only managed to shout for help in an attempt to escape, but Kyle noticed his escape as soon as he turned around at the sound. It turns out that the henchman couldn't leave the apartment after encountering a bluish magical barrier created by Kyle, and no amount of punching or appealing to the leader could help him. A bright blue beam pierced the head of the shield-wielding henchman, killing him instantly. Khan called out to the shield guardian who had fallen to the ground, while Kyle noted that the warrior with the shield should stand in the vanguard and stop the enemy's attacks. But this one had cowardly fled, showing his back. Kyle appeared behind Guild Director Khan, announcing that it was now his turn. He asked the man with a grin that he hadn't expected something like that, and asked if everyone here was that cowardly. At this time, the man tried to feverishly figure out who was in front of him and why such a young guy owned both ice magic and protection, and could emit a strange beam from his fingers, not understanding what it was, and doubting whether it was magic, and not understanding how the magician could stop his attacks. Khan noticed that if he looked at the world around him, despite the large scale of their battle, there was absolutely no damage to the house, wondering if it was an accident. Khan called Kyle a bastard, asking what he had done magically to the place, and if he had prepared for their arrival. Kyle grinned and told the man that he simply used the soul of his sword and covered the entire space around him with it, since he had not been home for a very long time, and he could not allow the guild members to destroy everything around him. The guy remembered the past, realizing that he would not be able to explain it in more detail, since it was difficult. But he explained that as soon as the invaders entered this house, they immediately found themselves in a world ruled by Kyle. Guild President Dawn became angry at this response, activating his power again and preparing to attack Kyle, considering him a monster. The man didn't intend to die in this place, so he gained enough strength to activate the Berserker skill. He used up most of the red magic power swirling around him, and used the next skill called Fury. Kyle, as always, calmly watched what was happening, generally agreeing that for someone he might be a monster. But the red flashes of someone else's magic did not frighten him at all, and he only thought out loud that the aura around Khan had increased. And for now, Kyle did not know what the man was going to do next. The guild leader once again prepared his magic-infused sword to attack Kyle in rage mode. He used the same technique, making many strong and fast strikes in an attempt to hit the guy, but Kyle dodged them without any problems, as if he saw all the movements in advance. Bart Becky replied that this didn't make Khan any better, but rather, it was as if he had lost his mind and become crazier. Kyle directed his power into the sword lying on the floor, broken at the end, filling it with blue magical energy and lifting it from its place, calling it to him. He no longer had any desire to stand on ceremony with the guildmaster who had disturbed his peace, so he simply prepared for the blow, adding more of his power to the sword. One precise swing of the blade was enough for Kyle to strike the man, fatally slicing his body. The guy himself simply passed his opponent without receiving a single scratch. Khan only had time to try to call Kyle a monster again, to which Becky's brother said that he should know his place. Turning around covered in blood, he noticed that Khan was nothing compared to the immortal Sword Emperor that was Kyle. Soon Becca brought Alice to her apartment, inviting her to come in and walk through, but was surprised that the front door was open and looked inside in shock. Her brother was diligently cleaning someone's blood from the floor, and nearby there were bodies piled on top of each other. And when his sister indignantly asked what had happened and why the front door was open, he only said that she was late. Wringing out a blood-stained rag, Kyle simply said that his sister shouldn't be surprised because they were guests he had invited to their housewarming party. But Becca didn't understand anything, indignantly asking what kind of housewarming party it was and how it could turn into a bloodbath. The sister insisted that she had just arrived and this had happened, and insisted that his brother explain himself. But Kyle only replied that he liked his sister's determined look, and that in the world of Miriam, she would have become much stronger. Alice casually noticed that the apartment looked cheerful, and Kyle only noticed her, mentally asking who she was. After all, he felt how the heavenly harmony of pure art resonated next to her. Alice in turn looked at Kyle, wondering who he really was. She looked at the boy smugly, mentally noting that he probably thought he was the only one who had been to Miriam, and that it was a big surprise for him to meet someone who might know about the place where he had been missing for 14 years. On a sunny day, the world around the Bennett house was quiet and calm. Becca slept peacefully in her bed, undisturbed. Suddenly the girl woke up, sweating from one thought that frightened her. She jumped out of bed and headed deeper into the apartment to make sure she was just having a nightmare. Stopping at the threshold of one of the rooms, she hesitantly called out to her brother, realizing that she could not find him. Standing in the rays of the morning sun, Kyle, already with a short haircut and in clothes familiar to this world, noted with surprise that Becca had gotten up very early. The girl turned around, not expecting to find him at the window. Kyle smiled carefreely as he stood by the open window, slightly worriedly asking his sister if she thought he had disappeared again. Becca was glad that she hadn't dreamed it all and that her brother was really with her now, so she asked why he didn't sleep a little longer. The sound of an incoming message caused Kyle to be distracted, asking his sister for a break in the conversation, and Becca agreed. Kyle read the text carefully, taking the message seriously. It was a message about an important call, and the guy went into another room to answer it, leaving Becca alone. The girl saw him leaving the house from the window, worried that a week had passed since his return, but everything seemed unreal to her. That meeting between the deputy head of the Dawn Guild, Alice Labora, and Becky's brother was not particularly fruitful, as they did not talk about anything, and the only thing Alice said then was a promise to meet again. What was also strange was that after some time, people from the Dawn Guild arrived and took away the bodies of Director Khan and his subordinates. A news report the following day informed the townspeople of Gray's death and Director Khan's resignation, and numerous news articles were filled with speculation about the motives behind Director Khan's abrupt choice. Alice Labora kept her promises, and the Bennett family was not harmed. Becca, watching from the window as her brother talked to the driver of a car that had just pulled up, recalled that she, as the only survivor in the Red Wolf's dungeon, was given a long leave. The girl knew that at the time of the call, Alice Labora was talking to her brother and invited him to her place, so she wondered what the deputy head of the Dawn Guild wanted from Kyle. Looking at Kyle leaving, Becca quietly said that he should return from his meeting with Labora unharmed. Alice sat at a table in an authentic Chinese-style cafe alone. She was enjoying tea from a small light-colored bowl when her guest disturbed her, stating that she had nothing better to do at the moment. It was Kyle, who had come at the girl's invitation, who clarified that his small family with Becca had been under 24-hour surveillance since his meeting with Labora, and wondered what could be interesting about that. Alice smiled innocently, pretending to be embarrassed that her surveillance had been discovered, and said that it was for the safety of their family. But Kyle, sitting down at the table across from her, waved it off, saying that the situation could be left out. Kyle took a sip of tea from the bowl, immediately recognizing the variety. Labora was glad that the guy recognized the type of tea called Chinshan Silver Needle, and she shared that she often goes to this particular tea house to taste this rare tea. Alice didn't intend to drag out the small talk for long, getting straight to the point and asking Kyle to tell her about his arrival in Miriam. Kyle replied with a smile that meeting Miriam left him with bad memories and he didn't like it too much, so he suggested that the girl be the first to tell about her experience. She placed the cup back in the saucer, reporting that at the moment there were only 3 repatriates, those who had returned from Miriam, 2 of whom were she and Kyle himself. The third to return from Miriam was the head of the Twilight Guild, Max Paxville. The Twilight Guild was as influential and powerful as the Dawn Guild and had the same huge number of hunters. But at the moment, both guilds had disagreements and did not get along with each other. At the same time, Elisa reported that she and Maxim once compared their stories of their stay in Murim and discovered something in common. They disappeared together in 2011 and both ended up in an unfamiliar cave. Each one had a mysterious treasure on one side called the Heavenly Harmony of Pure Art, which was a book engulfed in purple magical fire. And on the other side of the cave, there was an exit to a world called Murim. Alice reported that this was a similar experience with Max and asked if Kyle had the same. The guy remembered how, after leaving the cave, two signs appeared in front of him, asking if he wanted to return to the original world. And if his desire to return is great, then he needs to see the end of this world. Kyle confirmed that in his case, everything was the same. And Alice continued that they were able to return to the ordinary world only after several years. And when they returned, here, in their home world, the era of hunters and dungeons began. And about Murim, in which they spent some time, she still did not find anything, noting that the changes in their real world are connected precisely with Murim. Alice asked the guy if he knew when the hunter and dungeons conditions appeared, and Kyle replied that it was 14 years ago, after the revelation of the goddess. It was that girl in light clothes who was worried about the fate of this world. Alice confirmed that this was true, and after the revelation of the goddess, dungeons, monsters, and hunters suddenly appeared, and with them classes and skills, and all together it began to look very much like RPG games. The girl finished her story, asking Kyle if he had any questions, and he asked how exactly he and Max returned to Earth, whether they reached the end, to which Alice easily answered that they returned as soon as they died there. She asked if that was how Kyle had come back, and seeing his depressed and upset state, she asked what had happened and if maybe she had said something wrong. The cup in Kyle's hands cracked with the realization that he had no need to disappear in Murim for so long and could have simply left. The guy was smiling on the outside, but inside he was experiencing a storm of negative emotions from the realization that he could have just ended up back. In his mind, the boy asked the goddess if she had sent him there, while hundreds of notice boards were in front of the chained stranger's face, and Kyle continued to ask why all this was happening. The stranger in chains smiled ominously, while Becky's brother continued to lament that his reward for 140 years in Murim was only reaching the maximum level for which he was sent to Earth. And Kyle believed that this was a small reward, and he deserved to be given a greater one. Enraged by such realizations, Kyle loudly complained that the reward should have been at least an answer to his question, because he achieved everything with sweat and blood, and the goddess did not even give him answers. Alice, who Kyle was looking at that moment, looked at the guy with fear and confusion. The guy quickly switched over and asked why the girl invited him and what she wanted from him. Taken aback by her guest's sudden change of mood, she looked away, asking if he would like to go for a walk. Alice started by calling not only Guild President Max Paxville and his entire Twilight Guild an enemy to Dawn, saying that they already had a tense relationship with them, and frequent conflicts day after day, and now after Director Khan's death, it will only get worse. Since Kyle was the one who killed Mr. Khan, who was one of the main forces of Dawn, he must take responsibility. Alice invited Kyle to join the Dawn and promised to give him a high position, provide him with fame and fortune, and she was sure that he should not refuse such a good offer. Kyle looked away, noting that it was difficult for him to ignore the remark from his sister's boss. However, when the guy looked straight at Alice, she said that despite the circumstances, he still refused her. He turned around and was about to leave when the girl stopped him by asking why he was refusing, and Kyle had to explain that he was going to be on his own. He took a few steps, turning around to clarify his answer. Kyle smiled, asking if she would agree to submit to someone weaker than herself, hinting that his strength was greater than the entire Dawn Guild. Alice looked at the smug boy in front of her with distrust, assessing his capabilities. It didn't take her long to make her next move, inviting them to test who was weak. Kyle thoughtfully asked Alice if she knew that 1 year in their world was equal to 10 years in Murim, and once again reported that he had been there for 140 years, pressing that this alone should be enough in their argument. Alice rightly noted that age is not proportional to skill and strength, and the guy agreed with her, adding that any person who lived in Murim for 300 years would not become stronger than Kyle. Alice asked the guy if he was sure about this, and activating her power created a small purple magic ball. Having spoken the command to open the barrier, she sent a stream of energy forward. He raced across the grass towards Kyle, leaving a purple trail behind him. Having drawn a border across the clearing, the magic ball almost reached the guy. The ball stopped at the end of the clearing and hung several meters above the ground. A moment later, it burst into a bright flash because Alice activated her origin skill called Shadow Play. Kyle was currently assessing the effect of the spell that outlined a limited space around them. Noticing that some of his feelings had left him and the space around him had become darker, he also estimated that the radius of action was 50 meters, and in Muram, it would take a lot of time and effort to create such a form. Alice, watching with the guy as the ordinary world was left behind the curtain of the spell, explained that this was her origin skill. She said that what was happening could be considered the creation of a new space that imitated the real world, and from the outside it looked like they just disappeared. Alice stepped forward and noted again that such a skill was called Blood Plum Blossom in Muram, and she had never failed an assassination mission using it before. Kyle noted with a grin to himself that now it was clear why she could kill easily, and also clarified that their fight now would be comparable to a fight against water with tied hands. The girl, having activated first one and then the other sword with her magic, which enveloped the weapons in bright crimson flashes, said that it was easy to get out of this space, and all that was needed was to kill her. Alice looked scary as she swung her blades, adding that the second way to exit the illusory world was the death of Kyle himself. Kyle took her words too lightly, noting that it was quite funny that she was trying to kill him, and noting that such a skill could be used for more than just locking. The girl didn't have enough self-control to stand on ceremony with the guy, and she made a sharp lunge, trying to reach his neck with the blade. Approaching Kyle, Alice agreed with him, continuing her attack. Only all the attacks and attempts to get Kyle remained unsuccessful, and the guy easily dodged, not allowing himself to be harmed. Alicia took a step back to swing for another blow. She used all her strength and skills to attack the enemy with lightning speed from many sides at once. But this was not a problem for the guy, and he easily repelled all her attacks with his hand. Kyle kept an indifferent expression on his face, as if the girl's blows could not even theoretically cause him any significant harm. Alice took a few steps back in order to gather her strength and approach the enemy with a new attack. She crossed her blades to direct a new stream of attack magic at Kyle. The boy had to jump back to avoid the blow, noting that he found it interesting that Alice was able to change the direction of the daggers with one hand, and that it was a unique form of weapon. Kyle said that only the best assassin in Muram, called the Dark King, had such a technique, who had the special skill, Moonlight Blood Path, and Alice was surprised that Kyle recognized her at first sight. Becky's brother smiled, saying that he had already met the boy who claimed to be her successor, but Kyle himself was young then. While finishing off the girl morally, he says that this is why he instantly killed him. Alice froze in shock at this news, not expecting such a denouement. Kyle stood to the side, saying that he would give the girl 3 tries to use her Muram skill to try to get him, and if she could hurt him, he would agree to join Dawn. The guy asked her to start, and Alice tightened her grip on her dagger. She began to concentrate mana around herself again, creating a dark red cloud of power, agreeing to begin attacking. Kyle, observing not only Alice but also his own feelings, noted that in the world Labora created, it was as if the feelings disappeared, as if there was nothing there, and he even slightly felt like a lost kitten in a huge hostile environment, wondering if this was the effect of her skill and power. Meanwhile, smoke swirled in the dark red fog, creating whirlpools within which purple magical flashes were born, clearly posing a threat to Kyle in the future. The guy watched this with a relaxed smile, as if he saw nothing new in this kind of technique. Meanwhile, the magical clots soared upward, uniting into a large whirlwind not only from the air, but also from the stones. For a few moments they hung high above Kyle, and then, filled with magical energy, they gained strength and chose a direction to strike. In an instant, they all rushed down to attack the guy who had jumped to the side, gaining speed and trying to inflict significant damage on him. Kyle extended his hand, quickly summoning his blue magical energy and concentrating it in one place. He fired a multitude of magical charges to the sides, smashing all the projectiles flying at him with his blue energy fire. The guy jumped to the side, watching as his mana easily destroyed the hostile red flashes. He raised his hand in a defensive gesture, commenting on his opponent's attack as not bad. His outstretched hand was a shield for Alice's next attack, which Kyle easily calculated, parrying without the slightest loss to himself. He chuckled and informed the girl that she was quite far away, noting that it was her second attempt, causing the girl to be displeased with his reaction. She jumped to the side to maneuver, noting that she knew about it. Having retreated a short distance for the next attack, Alice reported that in the world of Muram there was the strongest man named Shaolin, and he lived there for 150 years. And since Kyle lived there for about the same amount of time, he was most likely comparable to him in strength. Kyle, who did not attach such pathos and significance to this, and even after Alice's words that most likely in the world of Muram he was the strongest person, only nodded, disinterestedly agreeing, striking the girl with his indifference. Alice activated her energy streams, which immediately raised pillars of stones from the ground nearby, showing their power. The girl, surrounded by dark, bright streams of her energy, spoke out loud about her desire to kill Kyle, wondering what would happen next. Will she become the strongest of Murim, while surrounding her with streams of powerful dark energy mixed with Kyle's stones? The guy, who was calmly watching what was happening around him, chuckled, saying that she was most likely right. He continued to watch as Alice lifted many large rocks from the ground with the energy streams of her mana, concentrating the small streams into one large one, and wondered if she had enough strength and power to actually kill him. The girl did not listen to him, completely concentrating on using her power, which filled everything around with magical strands, lifting everything up. Alice used all her power, using an assassin skill called Shadow Daggers. The large pillar of energy and stones that formed behind her easily obeyed her when she used the skill, and the girl, with a cross-shaped swing of her arms, directed all the magical daggers towards her opponent in a deadly attack. Kyle stood in one place on purpose, watching as the magical energy wrapped around the stones turned into deadly tendrils heading straight towards him. The boy used just one skill called Sword Soul to create a small beam of energy and protect himself. But its power was so great that the force of the explosion from even a small energy ball was colossal. This energy and power was enough to dispel all the dark red magical strands that were meant to kill him in an instant. Alice could only marvel at the strength and power of this guy. True, following the flash that almost blinded her, a huge stone flew at the girl, which she did not expect at all. She tried to move to avoid it, but realized it was impossible. Something was holding her back, not allowing her to move even a centimeter from the place where the huge stone had attacked. Someone's hand swung forward with force to strike. Kyle stood between Alice and the huge stone, shattering it into 100 small pieces with one blow of his fist, which flew in the opposite direction from the force of the blow, thereby saving her life. Alice looked at his hand, which was completely unharmed by the blow, as if enchanted, and Kyle himself said with a smile that this was her third attempt, but if she wanted, they could continue. The girl, trembling from the horror of imminent death, answered with a short pause that no, she would not continue, admitting that she had lost. The pink curtain that separated their illusory world from the real one slowly dissipated. Alice promised Kyle that this would not happen again and asked permission to ask one thing. The girl was slightly wounded, while Kyle didn't have a scratch, and she wanted to know what the guy had done, because for a moment it seemed to her that she was fighting an invincible creature whose capabilities were beyond this world. The boy slowly lowered himself to the ground, crossing his legs, to tell her in detail why this happened, starting with the fact that he assumed that this would happen if they fought in that illusory space, and that if there was an ordinary person there, he would be killed immediately, even if his strength was beyond the pale. Alice listened to the guy's words in shock, surprised by what he was saying, because she was able to survive. She tightened her grip on her dagger, asking one simple question to find out just how strong Kyle was. He noted that the girl was very effective in combining her martial arts with her skills, and that was the answer. And the guy also noted that he would like to return to their previous conversation. While Alice was hiding her twin blades in her magic pocket, he said that he would still like to accept her previous offer of cooperation, but on his own terms, which consisted of material support for Kyle and his family, as well as providing them with information, for which the guy himself would help the Dawn Guild. The only condition was that he still had no intention of becoming a member of the guild, intending to maintain his status as an outsider. Kyle suggested that Alice evaluate this as an alliance, since the guy did not want anyone to command him or help him. The girl, having listened to him thoughtfully, after a short pause replied that she agreed to his conditions, but asked him to promise one thing. Alice asked Kyle Beckett that he would not support any other guild except Dawn, including Twilight. The guy stood up from his seat with a smile, saying that she shouldn't even swear off something like that. Extending his hand to Alice, Kyle introduced himself once again, stating his title as the Immortal Sword Emperor, and stating that he would not betray his word. In his mind, he added that this was generally part of his plans, since he was going to fight the strongest of this world. And out loud, he asked the girl to remove all the security and surveillance that she had put on their family, saying that he tolerated them only because of his sister's work. But now, he did not know what could happen to them, hinting to the girl that she should understand what he was warning her about. Alice did not answer directly, once again reminding that she was not going to harm their family, and Kyle thanked her for understanding this situation, hoping that she would remove the surveillance voluntarily, meanwhile drawing attention to the girl's injury. And the next moment, the guy tore off part of the sleeve of his top shirt. Kyle handed the piece of cloth to Alice, asking her to forgive him, and she could only look at him in confusion, asking what he meant. Becky's brother explained that he had provoked the girl into attacking her with his talk of 3 attempts, stating that his true goal was to see her prowess as one of the strongest people in the world. So he felt embarrassed that she was injured as a result of the battle. Alice replied with a grin that, of course, she thanked him for his kind words. But there was nothing terrible about her wound, since thanks to his power, she was able to gather the determination to kill Kyle, to which the guy sheepishly noted that the girl herself had been aiming for vital organs from the very beginning. Meanwhile, Kyle wanted to ask one more thing, clarifying why in the world of Murim, Alice chose the path of a killer. The girl just chuckled, noting that she didn't think that Kyle was thinking about something like that. Because in that first cave, where all the people who ended up in the training world ended up, she almost went crazy, and she had a crazy desire to kill someone, so she stopped on this path. Kyle took note of the girl's choice without responding. He again remembered the system messages popping up, asking if he wanted to return to the original world. And if he really wanted this, then he needed to see the end of this world. Kyle answered himself that he had hoped that Alice would be able to understand him, because the guy had been thinking about such a message the whole time he was there. A business-class car stood at the edge of the forest waiting for its passenger. The driver looked impatiently at his watch, as his boss was late. He heard the sound of the back door opening, and through the rearview mirror, he finally saw the one he had been waiting for so long. The driver immediately turned to the passenger, seeing her injury and asking if everything was okay with the deputy guild leader, clarifying that she even used shadow play and wondering how strong her opponent was. Alice only noted that even such a powerful technique did not allow her to touch her opponent with a dagger, and he exceeded all her expectations. She had used up too much energy, which eventually ran out, which the driver couldn't believe. Thinking back on the fight, Alice realized that Kyle had never even attacked her. Moreover, the girl had no idea how he blocked her daggers. Her mood was too depressed after the fight, especially when she admitted complete defeat. The driver said he thought it would be best if Kyle Benet did not join the Twilights, and asked if the clan's deputy leader had thought about sending the boy to the Feast of the Sun. Alice, her shoulder bandaged with her former rival's shirt, said that to stop Max Paxville they definitely needed Kyle Benet, and she was willing to do anything to get it. The girl remembered the frightening feeling of danger and Max's instruction that wisdom was with him and she had to follow his will. He claimed that the girl was obliged to submit to the heavenly warrior, and Alice, either following those precepts or choosing her own path, told the driver that they should do everything they could to help Kyle Benny. Kyle returned home after meeting with Alice, informing his sister of his arrival. Becca rushed excitedly into his arms as soon as she saw him. The guy didn't expect his sister to be so worried, asking what happened. But his sister was not only happy to see him back, she was also angry at Kyle. After all, she was beside herself with excitement while he was gone, asking him next time not to go anywhere, not to take risks, and just stay at home. Becca was haunted by memories of the past and shared her worries with her brother, saying that every time he left, she felt like he would never come back. Kyle touched the girl's head, saying that he understood her feelings. At the same time, he warned her that he wanted to become a hunter, which contradicted his words about caring. This news upset Becca, and she asked Kyle if he really wanted to die that much that he chose this way. The guy showed her a small cube that shimmered in all shades, saying that Alice had given it to him, calling it a mystical cube. Kyle said that Libera said that only with this cube can Kyle get the hunter status window, to which Becca, skeptical, also wished her brother luck without due joy. Her attitude did not dampen Kyle's determination, and he took the cube, preparing to begin his journey. The mystical cube in his hands glowed, activating and beginning the process. Bright, multicolored lights illuminated Kyle in the entire room. Gradually, the glow of the cube began to fade, as did its integrity. The cube began to float at the edges, as if it had melted. Eventually, the light coming from the cube finally died out, leaving the guy with the remains of the cube in his hands. Confused and slightly upset, Kyle asked his sister if Alice Libera had tricked him, but Becca said that was how it was supposed to be and advised him to shout out status window. The brother listened to his sister's advice and said the cherished phrase, immediately after which 2 different information boards opened in front of him, one of which was blue and the other yellow. The yellow one was a status window from the Murim world, and Kyle had never seen it before, and it showed his strength from that world, telling him that his level was 100, which was the maximum, and all his other skills were also developed to the maximum level. When Kyle looked at the blue sign trying to figure out what it meant, he was met with empty meanings. The blue plate symbolized the hunter's status window, characterizing Kyle, stating that he was level 1, his health bar was full, and he had one attribute point available that he could use on strength, endurance, agility, intuition, or spirit. The thing that interested Becca most about her brother's sign was what grade he was in. But when she saw the necessary line, she froze in shock, because the sign said that Kyle had no class. Delighted with the negative result, she told Kyle with a joyful smile that the hunter was definitely not his, and he should just forget about it. And Kyle looked at her in confusion, asking why she decided so. Becca asked if she had told him about the hierarchy of hunters, and realizing that she had not, she said that hunters were divided into 6 classes, the first of which were warrior, priest, and mage. Then came the priest and the assassin and the archer. But there were many more classes, if you include the higher ones, and these 6 were considered the main ones. For example, Becca was from the archer class, and her highest class was a sniper. And the girl also added that the main classes are innate and cannot be changed in any way. And Kyle has no class at all, which means he never had a chance to begin with and never will. Kyle, defeated by this knowledge, sat there dejected, while Becca continued, informing him that it was possible to become a hunter in general without a class, and the whole problem was only in skills, hoping that in this way she would be able to completely demotivate her brother, and hope that he would give up. To increase his level, according to Becky, a hunter needed experience, and points could only be obtained by defeating a monster, but this required skills. And unlike hunters with 6 main classes, hunters without a class did not have these skills, and they could only be obtained through the skill cube. But the cheapest cube with hand-to-hand combat skill cost 20 million, and fencing cost 25 million, which were huge sums. Becca frowned, turning her gaze to Kyle. The sister asked him with a demonic smile if he had any money, causing Kyle to turn away. A sudden thought struck Kyle, keeping his spirits up. He had Alice Labora, and the deputy head of the Dawn Guild must have a lot of money. And this thought encouraged Kyle and made Becca turn away in annoyance, upset that she could not dissuade her brother. Kyle took a breath, mentally noting that he might have had problems without this alliance with the Dawn Guild, but then he remembered that it wasn't his biggest problem. Thinking back to his life in Murim, he wondered why he had no class, since he was a genius, which he thought would never be seen in Murim history. And here, he had no talent as a hunter, since such a discrepancy was impossible. Mount Chia, located in the training dungeon of the Dawn Guild, was calm, and strange rabbits were jumping around. Up close, they looked like cute little animals with red fur collars. But this was a deception, because the rabbits were actually skill training monsters. And because of them, this dungeon was called the Rabbit Dungeon. Becca just destroyed one of them with a well-aimed shot of a fire arrow from her bow. The girl turned to her brother, asking if he had seen it, and Kyle, not too impressed, stated that yes, they had caught a rabbit, without understanding what it meant. Becca reproachfully replied that with such an attitude, all novice hunters come to a bad end, and before their eyes the defeated rabbit turned into a red gem, and Kyle said that this would not happen to him. Picking up the gem from the ground, he asked Becky if it was a monster stone, and if it was exchanged for money, which she confirmed, adding that the gem was an environmentally friendly natural resource that generated a huge amount of energy when processed, and it was because of such stones that nuclear power plants disappeared one after another. At the same time, Becca warned her brother to be careful, because no matter how strong Kyle is, he does not know what can happen in the dungeon. At this time, the guy killed many rabbits at once with a series of light blows, causing his sister to look at him in bewilderment. Annoyed that he wasn't even listening to what she was saying, Becca watched her brother from the sidelines while Kyle realized that using normal attacks to defeat monsters wasn't giving him any experience. His blue hunter stat plate was completely unchanged. Taking a closer look at her, he noticed that she had fencing skills. He decided to ask his sister about this skill. While the sign said that this skill was a class skill, was passive and used without spending mana, had a rarity of D, which meant that it was available to everyone. Also, the mastery level was D, indicating the lowest value. And it was also a warrior class skill. It was possible to improve it, and it was activated automatically when using a weapon, which was a sword. Becca patted her brother on the shoulder, telling him not to worry and that they had a whole dungeon to themselves, and he would be able to master the skill in no time, while Kyle was shocked to see that the rarity and skill level were very low. The guy had never had a D level before, which didn't make him happy at all. His sister was trying to get through to him at the time, arguing that although she didn't know what kind of contract Kyle had with Alice Labora, the deputy head of the Dawn Guild was an unusual person, and Becca was sure that she would try to get the most out of Kyle's presence in the clan. But looking at her brother, she realized that he was not listening to her at all. Becca called Kyle again, seeing that something strange was happening to him, as if he was using his power, and his eyes were glowing blue. The girl called out to him in confusion, wanting to attract his attention. She already wanted to touch him, but he himself intercepted her hand. He turned around with a happy smile, announcing that he had found a better place. They moved there quite quickly. Becca froze in shock, looking around, unable to utter the question the first time, stopping only at the word, "How much?" This part of the dungeon was outwardly no different from the previous one, but there were so many rabbits here that Becca couldn't ask exactly how many there were the first time, finally asking the cherished question, to which Kyle calmly replied that there were exactly 337 of them, specifying that he counted them along the way. The siblings were standing on a raised platform, and even from here Becca could tell there were too many rabbits, so she reached for her bow, telling Kyle her thoughts and that he was still at a beginner level, but he assured his sister there was nothing to worry about. The amazed Becca only had time to call out to her brother, who was frivolous in her opinion, seeing how he, smiling serenely, jumped off the cliff. Kyle, while flying down the cliff towards the rabbits, was thinking that he had never experienced such shame. He, being an immortal sword emperor who had trained with the sword for several hundred years, ended up being a D-level swordsman here, and without a class. As he flew down, Kyle easily drew his sword from its sheath. He swung, making a circular pass and twisting in the air. He landed on the ground with great force, leaving a mark on the soil and a large energy wave spreading around. Because in fact, Kyle was very angry. He found himself down in a clearing full of rabbits. His sister, who remained on the hill, angrily called him an idiot, saying that she almost fainted from surprise. But Kyle only complained about her constant scolding. Then he turned to the angry rabbits, asking if they were ready. At that very moment, a multitude of blue signs with a warning exclamation mark appeared in front of him. They all contained a warning from the swordsmanship skill, insisting that Kyle should attack in lines. But the young man, not deciding whether they were trying to help him or harm him, simply cut them down with his sword. He didn't have time to deal with these notifications because they only got in his way. He was determined, and some incomprehensible notifications were just an unnoticeable hindrance. As soon as Kyle got rid of the signs, many rabbits immediately rushed to attack the frozen guy. They bared their powerful and sharp teeth threateningly, wanting to finish off the guy. Kyle tightened his grip on his sword, swinging it back to strike and activating his skills. His eyes glowed blue and his sword strikes were filled with the blue energy of his skill, striking down his enemies. This world didn't need to teach Kyle how to swordsmanship, because in Murim he was already a master of the skill. All his blows hit their target and the rabbits were defeated. The guy continued to reflect on the fact that skills appeared in this world 14 years ago. Only 14 years, while Kyle spent 140 years in Murim, which means this world needs at least another 100 years to teach him how to use the sword skill with its pop-up tablets. Another set of signs appeared in front of Kyle, blocking his path. He stared at them blankly, trying to figure out what they wanted from him this time. He read another warning, looking at the text with shock and confusion. This time, unlike before, the sign said that he had reached level A+, and Kyle turned around, asking his sister who had come up to him what that meant. Kyle poked around at the notifications, not understanding how to close them or how to change the settings. Becca stood back in shock, asking what her brother had just done. Kyle waved it off, saying that he didn't understand it, and saying that all of his swordsmanship should be displayed in the system, and that the fact that he couldn't find it was probably a mistake. The girl still couldn't understand where Kyle got such speed from, and how he was able to instantly reach level A+. Kyle finally found what he was looking for and called out to his sister. He asked if she mentioned that you could get experience points even with a passive skill that didn't use mana, and the girl confirmed it. Kyle smiled as he looked at the divine power skill he was able to open on the tablet. A window opened up for him, informing him that he had the ability Divine Power, which granted a special origin skill. Kyle's characteristics of this skill in terms of rarity and mastery level were at A+ level, which meant that he possessed the highest ability of mysterious origin and could freely transform his cultivation. Kyle enthusiastically checked his fists, explaining that he simply wanted to make his life easier in the future. The guy picked up speed and then swung sharply. His next strike, using hand-to-hand combat techniques, had devastating power, destroying everything around the epicenter of the strike. Becky reported that he can now use his martial art to gain experience. He didn't so much ask as simply inform his sister that the other strongest hunters of their world, Alice Libora, who was the deputy head of the Dawn Guild, and Max Paxville, who was the head of the Twilight Guild, most likely received their origin skills in the same way. Becca, stunned, was again speechless. She just clutched the bow in her hands, looking at it and feeling empty, because her brother used a normal stream of air to strike. The girl called out to her brother hesitantly, attracting his attention. Becca stood at a distance behind him, but she had a serious expression, saying that she wanted to know something. She gripped her bow tighter, giving herself confidence, and spoke, saying that she had guessed about it since his victory over the head of the Dawn Guild, Mr. Khan. But today she saw his strength with her own eyes, saying that it was amazing. The girl remembered what happened in the Red Wolf's dungeon, how her friend was bitten by the Red Wolf. She remembered how she herself was in danger, realizing that something like this might not happen again in the near future. But the case of betrayal of one's own fighter can be repeated, and there is no guarantee that it will never happen. And after all, it was Becca who led the team at that time, and she blamed her own weakness for their deaths. With tears in her eyes, the girl raised her bow, unable to look anywhere else and saying that she did not want to regret this anymore. She looked up at her brother, continuing that she knew she couldn't become as strong as her brother, but she still asked if he could teach her at least something in martial arts. Kyle placed a reassuring hand on his sister's shoulder, reassuring her that she shouldn't get upset and that he would tell her everything. The guy was happy to help her, although he warned her that he had never had any students and that he would be a strict teacher. Touched by her brother's consent, Becca looked at him with delight. While Kyle thought that there was nothing wrong with his sister's request, because Becca would not always be with him, and she should learn to stand up for herself, because no one knows what might happen in the future. The guy himself said that there was a point in her training which meant they should move on to another point, and the girl could only ask in surprise when he had managed to put the dots around. They used their powers to make quick jumps to move around the dungeon. During their journey, Becca asked Kyle what he would do next, since he had already mastered the skill of fencing. Oblivious to the danger above, she asked if Kyle was going to use his warrior skills. The guy was more attentive and he noticed the hostile rabbits. Swinging and activating his skills, he informed the girl that he could level up using his powers. With his next blow, he sent a blast of energy-charged air into the attack, hitting the target squarely. Becca shielded her face from the dirt caused by the explosion of her brother's powers at the target point, agreeing that his situation wasn't so clear on how to proceed further as a hunter. Kyle gestured to stop her from going any further, noting that he could now use his martial arts to develop himself. But to become a strong hunter, it is not enough for him to just be strong. He needs to learn certain class skills, and they just happened to be in a clearing full of rabbits. Kyle remembered Alice Labora, who was also in Murim, and upon her return was able to become stronger. She combined her skills and martial arts to do this, and Kyle needs to find skills that are compatible with his martial arts in order to increase his strength. A sudden realization struck Becky's brother, causing him to open his eyes in surprise. The guy jumped far ahead, leaving his sister alone and causing her confusion. Kyle rushed towards the place where there were most rabbits. He filled his fist with strength again and swung it forward to strike. The guy remembered that he had already managed to combine any skill with his strength. At the same time, in this world he also saw those skills that would be difficult to combine with his powers. For example, the magician's skill called Fireball, and all magic in general. Kyle aimed the balloon filled with his energy at the rabbits, once again exploding the final target and achieving his goal. Becca called out to him, warning him not to continue like this. But Kyle interrupted her, calling her name in warning, because he had just chosen the area of hunters that he would be able to combine with his martial arts. Sitting on the grass in a hail of gems that fell around him, left over from the dead carcasses of rabbits, he told the girl that he had decided to become a magician. Becca, as in all previous times, did not appreciate Kyle's choice, because she had already told him that since he did not have a class, it would be very difficult for him on the path of a hunter, and since he also chooses the path of a mage, it will be many times more difficult, because it was even more difficult to get the cubes of mage skills. The girl sighed heavily, turning away from the jubilant guy, deciding that she would leave everything as it was. Kyle opened 2 tablets with his characteristics again, one of which characterized him in this world and was blue, and the other transferred all his characteristics from their Murim and was yellow. And the guy noted that he had already become familiar with these 2 systems enough, and could confidently say that there was a very big gap between the Murim system and the hunter. Becca, who was collecting the gems in her bags, remarked out loud that they could stop worrying about waste, while Kyle was thinking about how Muris's stats window only showed the own body stats, and there was nothing but the internal and external levels, but even that little knowledge would be very useful to him while he was in Murim. But when looking at the hunter stats board, it showed everything from strength to mana, and it was more flexible in settings and had many features. Kyle noted that the nature of the emergence of systems is different, as if they were created by different people with similar abilities, and the hunter system gave experience and resources from killed monsters, and the reward was received instantly, which provided a reliable basis for strengthening, and with it, anyone could become stronger with a little effort. While in Murim, the path of cultivation was much slower and more dangerous. And to achieve a breakthrough there, one had to spend a lot of time practicing, and to improve one's skills, one had to risk one's life. True, sometimes there could just be luck. And according to legends, the hero of the past, who was called the Heavenly Warrior, became a god and wrote that magic book, The Heavenly Harmony of Pure Reason. Kyle remembered that this book was an ancient treasure that many had fought over in Murim, and it was in the cave with this book that he woke up when he got to Murim, not understanding where exactly he was. As he and his sister walked on, the boy continued to reason that at the moment when he found himself in Murim and considered everything that was happening to be self-evident, he had overlooked one circumstance. If for his homeworld, the being that gave people the hunter system was the one who calls herself the goddess. Does this mean that the being that sent Kyle to Murim was her enemy? That guy in chains who calls himself Heavenly Warrior? These thoughts made Kyle angry, because he hated the one who sent him to Murim. Time passed, which gave Kyle the opportunity to get used to everything. Thanks to the support of the Deputy Guild Don Alice Labora, Kyle became stronger. For a whole month now, he had been quietly wandering through the dungeons, raising his level, and at some moments, meeting with particularly strong and atypical for the earthly world opponents, it seemed to him that he was no longer in his native world. During this time, the guy reached level 22, and when fighting monsters that resembled livestock, he always joked that he would like some freshly cooked chicken. He did not forget about his promise to his sister, teaching her the 365 vessels in the human body. He also learned to speak in a normal way so as not to stand out. Looking at Becca, Kyle knew that for her age it was too late to study martial arts, although there was one way out. And here was Becca, sitting in front of him, asking him what happened. He carefully held her back, wanting to prepare her a little for the implementation of his idea, asking his sister not to cry or scream, even if she started bleeding. This kind of address slightly frightened Becca, because Kyle said it unexpectedly right after their joint meditation. The next moment, she screamed so loudly that it could be heard not only in their house, because her brother pierced his sister's vessels and directly injected his power into her. This allowed Becky to advance and her skills to improve. She could now pierce stones with her arrows, although she almost burned Kyle's hair during the procedure. The next time Alice and Kyle met, the Deputy Guild Dawn asked if everything was okay in their family. She didn't intend to be polite for long, however, and asked if she could get straight to the point. Kyle noted that Alice usually didn't stand on ceremony, saying what was needed right away, and the girl agreed, simply saying that Becky's brother should consider this a unique trait of Libera. The guy asked her what the girl was up to, since she hadn't called them for a long time, and offered to meet. Alice agreed, smiling as she closed the distance between herself and Kyle and addressed him by name. She extended her hand to him with a serene smile and asked if he would like to go on a date with her. Kyle, not expecting such a question, stared at her in surprise. It took him a moment to cross his arms and reply that although this kind of invitation was new to him, he would refrain this time, to which the girl asked him not to refuse so quickly. She said that a new dungeon had opened in a town not far from them, with a 10th level of danger, and a recommended level of 45 to 50, and such a dungeon was usually only allowed to high-ranking hunters, and of course, it was not the best place to go with someone of level 20. At the same time, Alice looked at Kyle with a smile and clarified that if it was him, then his low level would not be an obstacle to such a trip. The guy asked again, confused, if the girl wanted to go there together, and if so, why? Alice reported that high-level dungeons have a hunter number control that prevents large groups from entering them, and she wants Kyle to quickly gain strength as a hunter. The guy chuckled, picking up the bowl and clarifying that the deputy head of the Dawn Guild wanted his improvement to speed up. The girl indignantly pointed out that he was using terrible and outdated wording, even though he had lived for over a century, to which Becky's brother irritably replied that he understood, but he didn't look old. Pushing his cup away, he noted that whatever their union, he only supported her, and he doesn't understand why Labora needs to make him stronger and worry about it. Alice asked if Kyle had heard about the Festival of the Sun. She explained that it was an annual event held between the Dawn and Dusk guilds that helped show off the strength of the strongest guilds in Korea, but it was only a facade, and everyone around would think that they were strengthening their relationship. But in reality, these competitions were determining positions of power. The Festival of the Sun can be compared to a small war. Right now, there is a fight between the Dawn and Dusk guilds for the rights to the dungeons, and most of the fights will take place inside the dungeons, so the general public will not know much about their differences. But all this will resemble the beginning of a major war, comparable to the situation when small matches are thrown into a powder magazine. Kyle asked the girl, confused, what the guilds were fighting for at all, because if it was a fight over interests, then it was completely stupid. Pouring tea into her cup, Alice explained that the head of the Twilight Guild, Max Paxville, was to blame for everything, since everything had been stable before. But at some point, the guy had chased after power like a madman. Libra replied that Max had become subservient to the one called the Heavenly Warrior, which amazed Kyle. He stood up from the table with determination, immediately attacking Alice with questions about Max Paxville's relationship with the Heavenly Warrior. But the girl said that she knew nothing about the Heavenly Warrior and only heard that Max Paxville received a message from the Heavenly Warrior in the Murim characteristics window. Kyle returned to his seat, wondering what kind of message that could be as the girl continued to speak, saying that she couldn't confirm whether it was true or not, since the stats windows weren't visible to anyone. She also said that even if Max had received an order from a Heavenly Warrior, she still couldn't understand why he was doing this, since they had been friends before. After all, they were the only ones who experienced the horror of Murim. Kyle thought about her words, looking at the girl seriously. Alice looked up at him and asked Kyle to participate in the Sun Festival as an ally of Dawn. It was a beautiful day outside when they finished their conversation. The driver was waiting for Alice again in the car not far from that cafe. Returning to the car, the girl continued to explain to Kyle that the balance of power between the guilds had recently been on the side of the Twilight, and all because they captured all the dungeons and carried out frequent raids. If this information becomes known at the Festival of the Sun, it will be the end of the Dawn Guild. The girl gently reminded them that at such an important moment they had lost their leader, Mr. Can, who was their main strength. And after these words, Kyle began to feel tormented by her conscience. The guy brushed off his worries, saying that he understood the situation in general, but he still hadn't heard from Alice the reason why his growth was useful for their guild. The girl closed her eyes, turning away to the window and reporting that the Sun Festival would be broadcast to the entire world, and there would be a lot of foreign press there. Pointing her finger at Kyle, she asked if the guy still planned to show martial arts around the world, and that it would be difficult to do so without public confirmation, because few would believe just by words that he came from Murim, and on the part of other hunters, it would simply cause envy. Once again, Alice asked him if he was ready to confront the World Hunters Association, to which he refused, although he added that he still planned to fight them all. Once again turning away from him, the deputy of the Dawn Guild informed him that he needed to use only the skills of hunters at the Festival of the Sun, to which he agreed, since Katzel owed Alice in general and therefore could not object. Pleased with his answer, the girl was glad that he agreed and asked the driver to give her the suitcase, which surprised Kyle, who did not expect that he would need anything else. Alice opened the suitcase, revealing 6 magic cubes with the Maya skill and 1 magic skill each for the wizard and sorcerer that the guy had asked her for earlier. Bribed by this, Kyle began to take his decision to participate in the Sun Festival as an ally of the Dawn Guild more lightly, since he was planning to meet Max Paxville anyway. But besides the cube, Alice also gave him paper. And not just one paper, but several that began to fall on him from the sky. Finding himself surrounded by huge stacks of documents, the guy didn't understand what it meant. Alice explained that, unlike Murim, there were legal processes on Earth, and all these official documents were needed in order to confirm their alliance, to agree not only on the guild's assistance to Kyle, but also on Kyle's assistance to the guild. And the other document that the guy was holding in his hands was an official document of registration of a hunter and a guild. But Kyle did not understand why he needed to register a guild, and the girl explained that for mercenary hunters, the registration process for the holiday is very difficult, and because of this, there will be problems in processing the documents confirming their alliance. Waving a suitcase in front of Kyle, Alice asked if he knew how much all these cubes cost, and said that any of them were more expensive than the house, and therefore even because of them, it was necessary to sign a contract, to which the down-to-earth Kyle said that this should have been discussed from the very beginning. While signing another paper, he whined that there were too many papers. There they were asked to come up with a name for the guild, and Alice suggested that this was just a formality and that they could write anything. Kyle, after thinking for a moment, wrote, "Guild, Martial Arts," agreeing to everything the girl offered him. So after the paperwork, he went with her to a completely different place, the Wyvern dungeon of a town not far from them. The blue light of the energy that had transported them to a dungeon full of flying dragons, wyverns, quickly dissipated, and the boy noticed that he felt like he was running between home and the dungeon every day, as if he was going to school. Alice, looking at the sky, warned the boy to be careful, as the creatures were one at a time and were not too strong. But they reported that there were an awful lot of them around. Kyle confirmed her words, reporting that he sensed more than 3,000 monsters. He activated his power while looking forward, as he acted according to a certain pattern in any dungeon. He directed the stream of electrified destructive energy at the flying wyverns with joy, because the more targets there were, the better for him. Taking a couple of steps back to gain some leverage, Kyle prepared for the next attack. He swung his air whip, filled with deadly energy, preparing to crush the targets. In one blow, he managed to hit many targets at once. As always, Alice watched in amazement as the dead wyverns fell to the ground, turning into gems, and was surprised how Kyle was able to master the skill so quickly, since she had given him the magic cubes just a couple of hours ago. The guy explained that magical energy and energy management were very similar, so he had no problems, and Alice only noted with disappointment that she would not have been able to do that. Looking at how many opponents he defeated, the girl noted that he should not overdo it, otherwise his mana points will run out. But Kyle told her not to worry, because he is a martial artist. Alice still couldn't believe the number of monsters the guy killed at once, clarifying that he wasn't acting honestly. Kyle ignored her question as he collected his gems, then asked if the monsters in the dungeons were always the same type. Alice said that he was right, but Kyle then noted that this fact was quite strange. The girl began to explain that the dungeons appeared 13 years ago and then filled the entire world. But while she was saying this, she didn't notice that a monster had appeared high in the sky. This monster was descending rapidly, but even the wyverns couldn't notice it while Alice was talking about how there wasn't a single dungeon where there was more than one type of monster. Meanwhile, the claw of an unknown creature, a huge creature, dealt with one of the wyverns, and another low-level wyvern was thrown straight into the rock by a powerful force. It was a huge dragon, a different type of monster in this dungeon, which contradicted Alice's words that this could not happen. At this time, in a completely different place, a man scooped some grain from a bucket into a plate. He threw this food to the fish, which jumped out of the water with a desire to eat. It was the villa of Max Paxville, the head of the Twilight Guild in Seoul, the capital of Korea, and behind the man feeding the fish, there was a secretary guy in a suit holding a folder with a lot of notes, addressing the one who was feeding the fish as the head. The secretary's name was Sam Brudeau, and he was a subordinate of the Twilight Guild, who informed the man on the shore that they had received information about the suspicious whereabouts of the Deputy Guildmaster of Dawn, Alice Libera. Sam also reported that the Dawn Guild had a newcomer who was supported with all their might, and people said that it was with him that Alice went to clear the dungeon. The man asked again whether Alice had gone to personally clean the dungeon, throwing food to the fish once again. Sam confirmed that as a result of an internal investigation, they were able to find out that this hunter, with whom Alice went into the dungeons, was the brother of one of the leaders of the Dawn groups, Becky Bennett. The guy's name was Kyle, and there was one oddity in his biography. He disappeared for 14 years but recently reappeared. The secretary continued to report, saying that his appearance coincided with the resignation of Mr. Khan, who was the director of the Dawn Guild. But the man stopped Sam, asking where Kyle had been for 14 years. No matter how much Sam dug through his papers, he still couldn't find any information about this, since their intelligence still couldn't figure it out. But Sam said that they were able to find out something else. Mr. Khan did not resign, but simply disappeared, and the last thing he managed to do was go to Becca to teach her a lesson for killing his son Gray. The man who was feeding the fish took off his straw hat, putting it aside, and saying that it meant he was dead. He explained this again to Sam, informing him that Mr. Khan was definitely dead, and the secretary noted that this was not bad news. The man turned out to be the leader of the Dawn Guild, Max Paxwell, and he informed the secretary that Kyle Beckett was most likely in Murim. Kyle, meanwhile, used all his strength to continue fighting the monsters in the dungeon. His attack was successful, and all the monsters in his path were defeated. Kyle pumped his fist with a happy smile, noting that this was exactly the kind of pastime he considered fun. Alice, who was watching him, reminded him of herself, stopping his delight and informing him that she understood his state. She noticed, however, that a whole hour had already passed since Kyle had started testing his new skills. And having defeated such a large number of wyverns, the guy felt great, and the girl did not even notice signs of depletion of his health points. And during this time, Kyle practically cleared the entire dungeon, to which he said that he was already finishing. Kyle closed his eyes like a sage, noting out loud that he didn't know how to explain everything quickly. He asked if Libora remembered that suitcase with cubes and one of the ones inside, which was called the Life Exchange Cube, to which Alice agreed that she remembered and replied that it was an emergency skill that could exchange health points for mana points, clarifying if everything was okay with that cube. Kyle replied that in Murim, where he and Libera were, After reaching the 35th external and internal level, an ethereal body was created, which, as the energy increased, developed and strove for infinity. And after reaching the 40th level, the hero acquired immortality, and at the same time, his state was supported precisely by the energy of this ethereal body. And since this energy was infinite, then life became immortal, and therefore now, using this skill, he could draw infinite health. Alice did not expect such a complex chain, feeling empty from the excess of information. Kyle tried to simplify things again by having her focus on the concept of mana amounts. He asked her to imagine the source of infinite energy that Kyle had brought with him from Murim, and then to imagine that, thanks to the cube, he was transforming this infinite energy into an inexhaustible source of energy. And he was able to do this simply because even if these martial arts were different types, having reached the limit of one, it is much easier for him to reach the limit of another. And therefore for Kyle now, there is nothing unattainable, because he has already reached the limit in one. Alice only had time to ask how this was possible, but Kyle didn't answer, preparing to jump towards the remaining monsters to defeat them, because he wanted to destroy all the little things that were left in the area before the boss fight, leaving the girl perplexed. Deputy head of the Dawn Guild noted to herself that Kyle's strength was not his only advantage, because he had a very strong character, and now Alice considered herself an idiot, because she not only tried to use Kyle before, but also wanted to kill him. But now she realized that she did not have to worry about the Sun Festival with such an ally. Lost in her thoughts, she didn't pay attention to the remaining monsters attacking her, because she was on guard. With another blow, she struck down the attacking monster, continuing to think about Kyle and his example. Inspired by his example, the girl wondered if she could reach the same level, and the monsters continued to attack and their numbers did not decrease much. But the girl was on guard, and her strength and the power of her energy-filled blades were still enough to hit the flying wyverns. True, such a battle had its downsides, because Alice could not fly, and therefore during the fall, only with the help of her blade, which she caught on the rock, she was able to keep herself from falling. Only when she was hanging over the abyss with one hand could she appreciate how high she and Kyle had climbed in this new dungeon. Gathering her strength, she pushed off with her feet, making a big jump back up. The girl professionally planned her trajectory so as to defeat many monsters at once. Alice confidently landed on the ledge after another attack, looking back down into the gorge again. There were a lot of gems that the fallen monsters had turned into lying there, and she wondered when Kyle was going to take it all away. Labora hid her blades in the magic storage while thinking about what she had learned about the dungeon, and thinking that when she came back here next time, she should raise the level of the dungeon, since the characteristics inside were much higher than they should have been. And since there were flying monsters here, dealing with them in general was much more difficult. Looking around, she considered what kind of raid would be best for this dungeon, and that next time, she should have a team of 5 hunters, a tank, a mage, an archer, a priest, and a melee fighter. But thinking about the future, she missed the changes happening in the present. Someone very large flew right over her head. Alice looked up with a question, not understanding where someone so big could come from in this dungeon. It was a monster of another level and larger size, and it was the first time she had encountered one like this. She barely managed to jump to the side, saving herself from the attack of this creature. But an equally large dragon, on the other hand, flew towards her, intending to kill her, although Alice was not going to give up so easily. She took out her blades from the magical spatial storage again, preparing to fight. Only the loud noise of huge wings right behind her ruined the girl's plans. The huge monster could not only attack her, but with its wings it created air currents filled with magic, which were much stronger than the usual attacks of monsters. And Alice, who did not expect this, was unable to cope and repel this attack. Thrown from her place by this energy wave, she fell, frightened, thinking that only a demonic force could manifest itself like this, and the girl did not understand where it came from in the dungeon. The monster attacking her had no intention of giving up and pursued the disoriented girl, who believed that such appearances of monsters from other levels could be a mistake in the dungeon system. But then someone caught the girl who was serving and preparing to die. It was a joyful Kyle, smiling as he informed Labora that the monster had finally appeared. Alice, picked up in her arms, was surprised by Benny and asked him if the guy was really waiting for this particular monster and knew about it. Kyle only smiled and explained again to the one he had already said that when the entire dungeon was captured, stronger monsters would appear in it. At this time, many demon-level monsters filled the dungeon, while Alice clarified that it was Kyle who allowed such a monster to wander here, and the guy replied that he was just waiting because the bosses need to be dealt with at the end. Holding the girl in his arms, Kyle carefully informed her that even if such monsters were new to her, She should not be distracted. But she should not worry either. At the same time, he suggested that the slightly annoyed girl discuss the details later. But for now, they needed to stop somewhere. Having landed with Labora on the ledge, the guy thoughtfully noted that it was time for dinner and asked what she would like and if she liked grilled food. Alice, not taking the hint, replied that she thought it was not a good time for dinner. At this time, Kyle concentrated a whirlpool of fiery vortices in one hand and golden electrical energy in the other. Raising 2 fists above his head and crossing them, he was able to fully appreciate his own power. Opening his eyes, he directed his gaze forward, telling the girl that she should wait for him, because today they would have fried chicken. And the giant monsters that were about to attack the guy standing on the hummel were considered a wonderful dinner by him, because with his strength, he was going to fry these flying monsters. Alice could only watch in amazement as all the monsters in the sky died from the enormous power Kyle put into his strike. A moment ago, she watched as Becky's brother first used fire and then pure energy, wondering if the boy even heard what she was saying, since he said he would use magic. At the same time, she could say with certainty that his technique was more reminiscent of regular strikes. Alice immediately pulled herself up, because these were not simple blows, since each of them was imbued with pure power, and it was incredible. But what happened next made her freeze in place, looking at the sky in disbelief. The air above began to swirl, creating a distortion of the underground space. A huge green portal opened right in the center of the sky, from which even more frightening creatures immediately began to fly out. And Alice had no choice but to scream at Kyle to get out of there immediately. The girl couldn't believe that the monsters just started appearing from the suddenly opened portal, because there were too many of these flying creatures. And she also wasn't sure that Kyle was going to continue further, so she was going to save him by rushing off the ledge. But already in the air, she realized that it was even more dangerous next to Kyle, so she shouted at the guy again that he should run. The girl, confident that Kyle could not hear her due to the distortions in space, gathered all her strength for the blow. She needed to save the boy, even if it meant destroying everything in her path. But monsters endowed with demonic power also did not fly in the sky just like that. It was they who took the brunt of the girl's blow. Alice was shocked, because it turned out that the monsters in the dungeon were smart, and now the small ones were taking the hit, that Alice could not help Kyle. Shocked by this news, she could only continue to call out for Beckett and watch as the dungeon monsters formed a sphere. All the small and large monsters in the dungeon actually flew in a circle, creating a ball in the air. Alice, observing their behavior, realized that she was right, and judging by their movements, the small monsters moved involuntarily, and the big ones, who appeared later, commanded the smaller ones. And so when she tried to attack the big ones, they ordered the small ones to shield themselves. It was the death of some for the life of others, and now, in order to win, they would first have to defeat the big ones, although she had no idea how to do that. The girl wanted to get to Kyle, even though she didn't know if he was okay. Yes, she saw him, but the guy looked like he stayed there on purpose. Exhaling regretfully, she noted with disappointment that she did not understand what he was thinking, because he could have told her everything via mental communication. Noting what was happening around, Alice realized that she had encountered such anomalies for the first time, and no matter how strong Kyle Bennett was, it was dangerous. So she had to help, but since the creatures were in the air, she had no idea how to get there. Looking up, the girl noticed a small wyvern flying above her, which gave her an idea. She jumped on the monster's back, deciding that she could use the little one as a means to get to Kyle, since all the monsters were focused on him, although she should not let her guard down and press herself against the wyvern so that she would not be noticed. Alice sincerely sympathized with Kyle, wishing him to hold out longer, and thought that it would be easier if there were no abnormal monsters, not noticing the danger. One wyvern, noticing Alice on the back of another, crashed into her with force. The deputy head of the Dawn Guild did not expect this, so she could not hold back and fell down. At the same time, Alice was determined, and at the moment of falling she turned over, immediately choosing another Vivrena on whose back she could land. It was true that she was unable to jump onto it softly, and only her blades saved Alice, with the help of one of which she clung to the monster's body. The huge monster flying below noticed her maneuver and was about to attack. But Alice was more cunning, because the girl was already prepared for an attacking jump on this giant. In a one-on-one fight, none of the monsters could be a real threat to her, because it was not for nothing that she followed the path of a killer, and so the girl used her ability, Shadow Play, to open a barrier to the same space in which she fought Kyle the first time, only now it was a trap for the monster. But Labora didn't have time to complete her maneuver, because behind the demonic monster, there was a whole cloud of bodies of equally large giants who weren't going to give up their comrades so easily. Alice had to retreat, because she did not expect such coordinated actions from the dragons. A sudden beam of blue magical energy flashed past her face just a few centimeters away. It was Kyle who, finding himself in the midst of the monsters, finally began to act on his potential. Alice had to shield her face with her hands from the blinding magical light of Kyle's energy. The amazed Deputy Guildmaster of Dawn turned around, surprised to see that Kyle was able to summon a sword without a source of power. But he summoned not just one, but many swords, all of which he controlled single-handedly. Benet was indeed surrounded by a dozen swords created from his energy, while Alice couldn't understand how much energy was in this guy's body. Kyle held out his hand, indicating that he thought it was time for him to stop pretending to be a hunter. One movement from him was enough for all the swords to attack the monsters, and not one of them missed, reaching their target and killing everyone hostile to the couple in the dungeon. Since the guy attacked in all directions at once, he was able to hit all the flying targets. A moment later, all the monsters turned into gems, which rained red dots down to the ground as Alice watched thoughtfully. The girl understood that it was only thanks to Kyle Benet that they managed to cope with this, remembering how the monsters began to fly out of the portal. She wondered what she would do if the same situation happened in other dungeons. Would she and her weaker staff be able to handle such portals, let alone destroy such high-level monsters as easily as Kyle? Alice was deep in her thoughts about how she was currently too busy with the Sun Festival, and she should have immediately investigated the situation that happened in this dungeon, not noticing Kyle, who was twirling an unusual blue gem in his hands. Deputy Guildmaster Dawn knew that if she started investigating, Guildmaster Twilight Max Paxville would also find out about it, and then the Twilight Guild will be able to use the information and destroy her Dawn Guild. Lost in her thoughts, she didn't know what she should do in this difficult situation. Kyle showed her the blue gem again, bringing it closer to her face to break Alice out of her thoughts. The guy noticed that she was clearly thinking about something, and suggested that she take a break, telling him what kind of blue gem it was, because it was different from the stones of other monsters. Alice wasn't surprised by the blue gem in his hands, explaining that it was a monster skill stone, and such stones weren't common, so Kyle was lucky. However, she was not surprised that such a huge monster dropped such a small stone. But that wasn't what the girl was interested in right now, so she turned to Kyle. Alice, taking into account everything new that she learned today, wanted to have a serious talk with him. A month later, passers-by on the street were discussing the list of participants in the Festival of the Sun, speculating about what would happen this time. They had already heard many rumors about the sensational newcomer, Kyle Beckett, about whom there was a lot of information on the internet, part of which said that the guy became a hunter only a month ago, and at that time this conversation was heard by the secretary of the Twilight Guild, Sam, who was in a worried mood because of what he heard. The man, sweating, stood up from his seat, because he didn't like at all that the notorious newcomer supported the rival guild Dawn, since for the man it threatened to turn into problems. Sam looked up at the top of the tall skyscraper, sadly noticing that he would soon be a corpse, and he turned out to be right, because at an emergency meeting of the leaders at the Twilight Guild headquarters, one of the directors angrily smashed a glass over his head. This aggressive man was screaming and accusing Sam of the fact that a rookie hunter was chosen as a member of the Dawn, and Sam could not report on the level, skills, or even the location of Kyle Beckett for the past 14 years. The guild leader, Max Paxville, stopped the angry man by simply calling him by name. The leader of the Twilight Guild himself did not look as worried or angry as his colleagues, but calmly enjoyed the golden drink with a smile while looking at those around him. But his calm and friendly smile were deceptive, as one look and commanding tone were enough for the angry director to sit down in his seat. The man moderated his ardor and meekly sat down in his place. Max stood up from his seat, telling his colleagues that all this information about the newcomer was a mistake, and the Dawn Guild was hasty, revealing its cards earlier than expected. Looking at Kyle's photo, Max said that since their competitors had shown their fighter, they should also show their cards, because no one knows whether the opponent is bluffing, or, on the contrary, has won the jackpot. Guildmaster Twilight had confidence in his guild, telling his subordinates that they should destroy the sprouts of the enemy's power before they sprouted. After some time, the secretary of the head of the Twilight Guild found himself in a cafe where he was waiting for someone at a table. Sam was a little nervous looking at his watch, and there was only a cup of coffee on his desk. The man once again turned his attention to the dial, noting that the time for the meeting had already arrived. Finally, the one he was waiting for appeared in the hall, so Sam jumped up from the table, greeting the man. He thanked the man for accepting the invitation and showing up at the meeting. His guest turned out to be Kyle Bennett, the same rookie hunter who became an ally of the Dawn Guild. Kyle took in the surroundings with a practiced gaze, trying to figure out if there were any potential threats in the cafe. Sam distracted him again, doing his best to keep his guest focused on him and extending his hand in greeting. Kyle turned his emotionless gaze to the secretary's hand, making him nervous. But he did not refuse the greeting and shook her hand with his own. Kyle knew the man's name was Sam, but he asked again to make sure, mentally remembering that his sister had asked him to change his tone of voice, as after his stay in Murim, Kyle often chose the wrong words and used rude constructions. Sam confirmed that he was indeed a representative of the Twilight Guild and said that it was an honor to meet Kyle, mentally noting that Kyle's address sounded rude. Sam's thoughts made it clear that he was not so much offended by Kyle's rude formulations, but on the contrary, they would help him not to forget about the purpose of this meeting, because he had to find out as much information as possible, and the secretary of the Twilight Guild suggested that they move on to the purpose of this meeting. But first, Sam said he wanted to use a device, frantically rummaging through his bag, which Kyle watched with an emotionless face, mentally noting that if everyone in the Twilight Guild was as slobs as Sam looked, then should Dawn even bother with them? The secretary meanwhile placed a small device on the table, and when Kyle asked what it was, he said that it was a magical instrument called a soundproofing barrier. And when Sam pressed the button, a barrier formed around him and Kyle, blocking out outside sounds, and the Twilight representative noted that their voices would not leak out either, and such a device was ideal for private conversations. Kyle chuckled at the last definition of their meeting, and the secretary asked if the guy had any idea what they were going to talk about. Sam, in a serious mood, informed Bennett that the Twilight Guild wanted to form an alliance with the Boys Guild. Kyle asked if Twilight hadn't seen the Sun Festival participants, saying that he already had a partner in the Dawn Guild. The secretary confirmed that he knew this and said that he was aware of the fact that the guild was putting all its efforts into developing Kyle Bennett. Sam's next argument was that the Twilights also knew about the incident with Director Khan's disappearance, and they also knew about the joint raid of the Deputy Guildmaster Dawn into the dungeons. At the same time, the man noted that Kyle never joined Dawn, and according to the Twilight Guild, Kyle created the Martial Arts Guild only in order to enter into an alliance with the Dawn Guild. Sam, who had rhetorically asked whether Kyle was interested in how Twilight had figured this out, adjusted his glasses pathetically and answered himself, saying that it was all about the guy's close relationship with Dawn. Sam directly offered Kyle to join the Twilight, saying that he would promise him much better conditions than in Dawn, causing only a smile from Bennett, who thought that the representatives of the Twilight Guild were much braver than he thought, and it would be hard to ignore something like that. And Benny also liked the secretary's insight, and the offer was generally not bad, except for one but. Sam pulled out some papers, intending to discuss the specific terms of Bennett's support from the Twilight Guild, but Kyle rose from the table, saying that he had had enough of this conversation, and the secretary could continue no further. Kyle turned around and left, throwing a last word to the man that he only came to find out why the Twilight Guild invited him. But it turned out to be a waste of time, to which Sam objected that the guy was refusing without even hearing the offer. The secretary stood up from his seat, shouting that the Twilight Guild was willing to offer Kyle an amount that was twice what Dawn had promised, mentally nervous. Benet replied that he had promised Alice Libera that he would not accept the offer of the Twilight, and noted that he was not the kind of person who was so interested in money. Sam tried to stop Kyle, but he wasn't going to listen to him anymore, leaving the restaurant. The secretary was in despair, not knowing how to keep Bennett. Suddenly, a visitor in a cap, taking off his mask, called out to Sam, asking how long he was going to stand frozen in the middle of the restaurant. This guy turned out to be the disguised head of the Twilight Guild, Max Paxville. He addressed Sam by his last name, overwhelming him with his intimidating aura, and informing him that he seemed to have given his instructions clearly. All that was required of the secretary was to continue the conversation as long as possible. After all, if the conversation ended quickly, there was no point in eavesdropping on it, since Sam had a microphone on, and the head of Paxville had an earpiece. The Twilight secretary was very sorry that he was such a loser and couldn't carry out this task, but Paxville quickly let the situation slide. At the same time, Max noticed that Kyle seemed very strange to him. Paxville didn't understand what Bennett wanted, since he came to this meeting and didn't agree to the money. At this time, in a completely different place, a conversation was taking place between those Max was thinking about. Alice Libera listened with interest to Kyle's summary of the meeting with the Twilight Guild, noting that Paxville might be upset. Kyle on the other end of the line noted that most likely the head of the Twilight Guild already knows that he is from Murim, but when they met in the cafe, the guy's skill, heavenly harmony of pure art, did not resonate. Benet recalled that when he entered the cafe, he felt someone's energy, and Alice's assumptions came true. Max himself was there. The girl noted that the head of the Twilight Guild was quite cautious, and he was not one of those who sat and waited until the last perfect moment. So for now, he would most likely not touch Dawn and Bennett. And Kyle asked how the investigation of the dungeons was going, but the girl replied that so far there was no other information about the same anomalies as they had seen. With a smile, Alice especially noted that there had been no anomalies since their last visit together. She remembered that when she asked Kyle for a serious conversation in the dungeons, she had asked him for help with the investigation, and thanked her once. Benet asked if there were any other questions, and Alice replied that that was all she wanted to discuss. Labora only noted that Bennett's tone was too gloomy when asking if the guy was okay. At this point, Kayla's sister called out to him, asking if he was finished. After all, Becca was waiting for him to be free, and it was time for them to go. Kyle ended the conversation with Alice, agreeing with Becca, and turning his attention to her. And the reason for his gloomy mood was that they were standing in front of the cemetery they had come to. Becca led him to the place where their family's remains were buried. Touching the camera with the memorial photograph, the girl, with tears in her eyes, informed the deceased souls of their parents that her brother had returned. Kyle stood gloomy against the opposite wall, considering his presence here a bad idea. His whole appearance was detached and closed, in contrast to what was happening. He looked at the camera with his parents' things, realizing that from the moment he disappeared and returned back, he had changed a lot. And even seeing the ashes of his parents, he felt nothing. Turning around, he headed for the exit under the gaze of his crying and grieving sister, realizing that he shouldn't show this callous side of himself to Becca. After all, she had not forgotten how to experience emotions and sincerely grieved over the loss of her loved ones. Turning away from the ashes of her loved ones, Becca called out to Kyle, hesitantly asking if he was okay. After all, the girl noticed that he didn't look sad or upset. But Kyle had nothing to answer her, because he didn't want to upset her. Becca turned to Kyle, who had moved a short distance away with a fake smile, asking why he was silent. She was insightful in asking if he really didn't feel anything in that place. And Kyle had to apologize. He asked the girl to forgive him, because for her he remained the same brother he had been, although in reality he could not show her what he had lost during the time he had been absent. These emotionless and detached words angered the girl. In anger, she shouted that the strangest thing now was Kyle's apology, since that was not what she wanted to hear. Having caught her breath, Becca turned to him more calmly. Remembering their past, she asked him for not so much, as it might have seemed to the guy. Crying again, she asked why Kyle had changed so much, noting that even now he looked too normal. But she just wanted to see the brother she once knew. Kyle slowly reminded her that it had been too long for him, and he would never be the same again. But Becca said she didn't care because she didn't feel like she was living with her brother now. The girl angrily stepped aside, leaving Kyle alone. The guy once again thought that he shouldn't have come to the cemetery. Remembering everything that happened to him in Murim, he thought about the fact that he did not know the answer to the question of why he had changed, why this had happened to him. At that moment, a yellow table with Murim's characteristics opened right behind him. It was a status window with a slowly appearing question, the first word of which was why. The one trying to contact Kyle was the celestial warrior who was now imprisoned in multiple chains. The next line in the status window asked if Kyle still considered himself human, shocking the guy. It was this question of why he still considered himself human that was unexpected at the moment. Kyle stood frozen in front of the status window, unable to understand why this window had appeared. He reread the question, emphasizing that someone doubted that he was human. The guy clenched his fist out of anger at the nonsense written in the status window. The next bulletin board called on him to stop his senseless resistance, and the new one said that if Kyle needed help, he could contact the sender of the messages. Benet noticed that the unknown person continued to talk to him one-sidedly and asked who he was. The thought that struck him made him smile, and Kyle asked if the one called the Heavenly Warrior had spoken to him. Then his interlocutor got angry, saying that he would take everything from the guy again and that he should just wait. But Bennett called him crazy. The guy said he didn't know who he was or why he needed it, but he suggested that if the Heavenly Warrior really had enough strength, he should try to do it, just as he had already taken away his parents. Only Kyle said that if he couldn't, then Bennett himself would tear him to pieces. The last sign from Murim's window said that the guy should just wait. After that, the information window in front of him closed as if nothing had happened, leaving him alone. Only small yellow sparks of residual magic were carried by the wind around the guy. Only Benet was not frightened by this, because he was determined not to give up his own anymore. The sounds of Beck's footsteps could be heard in the silence as she went to look for her brother. The girl, her eyes full of tears, looked back uncertainly, certain that he must have been nearby. But there was absolutely no one around, and the place where she expected to find her brother was empty. She noted with disappointment that Kyle did not follow her or look for him, and she resentfully called him an idiot. A couple of days later, the long-awaited Sun Festival began, the broadcast of which was led by a very cheerful girl presenter, greeting all listeners and viewers. There was a lot of enthusiasm in her, because the public was going to see heroes today who would explore dungeons and hunt monsters. And the girl knew that many were waiting for this holiday, and her calm colleague could only dream that she would calm down and calmly agree. But she was not so easy to stop, and in a fit of emotion she rose from the table. She asked the audience not to worry, as everyone had been waiting for this day with the biggest event in Korea. It took place in a large sports arena that could accommodate many people and was about to begin. The girl, while everyone was shown the happy faces of the spectators, continued to talk about how this holiday was not only entertainment, but a place for strengthening ties between guilds and duels between hunters. And people could attend it with their whole family, since something like this could only be seen at the Festival of the Sun. Kyle, who was in a special room at the time and heard everything that was happening outside the arena, noticed that the Sun Festival was more like the Olympic Games. Alice Labora, who was sitting opposite him and sipping tea from a mug and saucer, said that no, and that there was a big difference between the two events, since the public was most interested in the hunters. They found themselves in the office for the participants of the holiday, furnished cozy and comfortable, and the girl continued to tell, saying that the interest in the event is also connected with the fact that the hunter's strength is similar to that shown only in the movies, and their fights look much more interesting than competitions of ordinary people. Elisa also added that such events help improve the image of hunters. Only the girl noticed that her friend's thoughts were occupied with something completely different, and he was not listening to her too attentively, so she called out to Kyle. The guy didn't answer, and she looked at him again carefully, putting the cup of tea aside. Kyle seemed suspiciously silent, and Labora assessed the situation and assumed that he had had a fight with Becca. Watching the two, Labora wondered why there had been a strange atmosphere between the brother and sister ever since their arrival. Alice was perceptive, immediately realizing that Kyle could be to blame for this, and asking the guy what happened between him and Becca, clarifying what exactly her brother did wrong and where he made a mistake. Surprising him with her insight, Benet gave in, asking Labora for help in finding a home and saying that he wanted to live in a quiet and secluded place, causing Alice to be confused. Kyle confessed to the deputy head of the Dawn Guild that he received a message in Muram's status window, which shocked the girl. Benet said he didn't know the goals of this sky god, but Kyle was definitely his target. That's why he took care of his sister, because he didn't know who exactly his enemy was. And Becca was his only weakness, and would definitely come under attack. It took Labora a moment to process this information, as she couldn't believe that Kyle had received a message from a heavenly warrior, and so suddenly, at the same time, Alice was sure that even if the heavenly warrior chose Kyle's sister as a target, it would be better for the guy to stay with her, because living separately for the good of his sister would be unsafe. Kyle frowned and remained silent at the words of the Deputy Guild Dawn. Benet, watching the happy family on TV, said that Becca doesn't need a brother like him. He looked at the child in the frame and said that this was not his opinion, but his sister's position, because the person she once knew was not him. So, upset, Benet continued his reasoning, reaching the point of thinking that his sister might be better off if he simply disappeared without waiting for a blow from Alice. And Labora, without warning, hit him right in the chest with her fist, silencing him. Without looking the guy in the eye, she said that she didn't like to interfere in other people's affairs. But if her brother had said that to her, she would have been offended by him and would never have forgiven him. So she turned to the shocked Kyle, who knew more about his sister Becca than Labora, and was about to say something about his sister. But the door to the room opened and Alice's assistant appeared, asking for the deputy head of Dawn. The man caught Alice and Kyle in a strange, threatening pose, and awkwardly announced that the party was about to begin, cautiously apologizing. Labora pretended nothing had happened, asking if her assistant had been trained to be in the door, and telling Kayla that they would talk about it later, and asking the guy not to go anywhere until she returned for him. So Kyle Benet was left alone in the room, able to process what had happened. The guy certainly didn't expect Alice Labora to be so angry with him, and now he had something to think about. At this time, before the start of the fights, an opening ceremony was to take place at the stadium, which the host announced to everyone. She announced the event's organizers, first introducing the Dawn Guild and its leader Richard Fraz, whose hunter class was Crusader. And then she announced the representatives of the Twilight Guild, on whose behalf the ceremony was to be opened by the deputy head of the guild, Sylvester Driggle, whose class as a hunter was an assassin. The presenter at this time asked her colleague if he thought it was true that Alice Labora and Max Paxwell were from the same guild, and he answered that it was true, wondering how the friends who started life as hunters together felt now that they met at the very top. An old acquaintance extended his hand to Alice Libera, who was standing on the stadium platform surrounded by a crowd, saying that they had not seen each other for a long time. It was a peacefully smiling and well-dressed Max Paxville, and the girl had to make a lot of effort to contain her negative emotions. She smiled sweetly back at him, asking him how he was doing. She noted that the guy standing behind Max, his second-in-command Sylvester, now working for Twilight, had risen quite a bit. True, such words of hers offended Driegel, and he immediately grabbed his sword, but was stopped by the leader's gesture. Paxville, without changing his expression, responded by reminding him that he knew that Alice was working on raising the level of the newbie, and Max especially noticed that she must have been doing this since she loved helping the weak so much. Alice was mentally angry, remembering the past and seeing Max as a terrible monster. The girl wanted with all her might to get rid of him with her own hands, since in the past he had brought a lot of pain to her and her loved ones. And Alice was determined, confident that no one could stop her from such a massacre. But that was in her thoughts. And in the real world, she had to maintain decency. So she answered with a confident smile that she would take Max's words as a compliment. And Paxville was pleased that his challenge had been accepted by a worthy opponent. Former friends and now enemies, they shook hands as the hosts announced that the Festival of the Sun was beginning. A guy in a dark uniform attacked his opponent in the ring with a scream. His magic formed dark red strands, which he used to use a warrior skill called sequential attack to fight the blonde girl who was using a shield. The blonde couldn't handle the force of his blow, and her shield couldn't withstand the power of someone else's magic. The brunette filled the spear with his dark red power, swinging it for the finishing blow. He easily defeated his opponent, crushing her defense. The girl lost this brutal fight, which was part of the competition. The hosts announced that this was the 5th duel, and with the girl's defeat it was over, because the winner was Gideon from the Twilight Guild, using his incredible strength, which he was able to show even with a weapon specially blunted for the competition, causing such enormous damage to the girl. The heads of the guilds, Dusk and Dawn, who were sitting in a special box, watched the fight, and Max Paxville, the head of Dusk, happily reported that he expected Dawn to be defeated, since their fighter had not lasted long against his Gideon. Alice, listening to Paxville's arrogant speeches, could not object, and he continued to reason that if everyone in Dawn was like that, then Twilight had nothing to worry about. Max rose from his seat, announcing that he would be stepping away for a moment. Finally, he told Alice that he hoped that in the next battle, the representatives of Dawn would be able to entertain him. The deputy head of the Dawn Guild, Alice Libera, only looked at him with displeasure, holding back her displeasure. Max Paxville, meanwhile, disappeared into the corridors of the collision where the competition was taking place. Under one of the arches, one of his closest and most loyal people, his deputy Sylvester Driegel, was waiting for him. He, having barely noticed Max, immediately called out to him and, drawing his dagger, he asked the headman for permission to answer a very sensitive question. While playing with the dagger, the boy casually asked if he could kill the deputy head of the Dawn Guild, Alice Libera. Max, turning to his charge with a serene smile, asked his deputy to relax and not rush into this matter. Paxville noted that everything has its time and asked if Sylvester knew Becca Bennett, to which the understanding deputy replied that he understood the gentleman's hint and would send his regards to the girl. Meanwhile, the celebration continued, and the next location looked like the streets of an ordinary city, and the hosts announced that this was the arena of the Battle of Archers, where the first actions would now take place. The location had many houses with open terraces and rooftops, which would be the perfect place for spectators to take advantage of the rare chance to see all the guild's expert archers. The excited presenter announced that the fights would begin any minute, asking her colleague if he had anyone in mind. The man replied that there would be many outstanding participants in the arena this time, but he would be rooting for Becca Bennett because she was achieving great results at such a young age. Becca was currently looking around the arena she would be fighting in while the hosts continued their dialogue, revealing that Becca had recently had an accident, dubbed the Red Wolf Dungeon Incident. The girl herself recalled the conversation that she had heard before in the locker room when her guild colleagues were discussing her participation, because in the Red Wolf's dungeon the girl had destroyed the entire group, fearing that if they were with her, a catastrophe would also befall them. Becca wasn't going to tolerate that, so she asked her teammates not to whisper about it, and if they had any questions to speak up and discuss it directly. This statement made the gossips embarrassed and hushed up the topic of conversation. And then he would leave altogether, leaving the angry Becca alone in the locker room. The annoyed girl crossed her arms over her chest in displeasure. She sighed heavily, but it wasn't the gossip she was worried about. Since the day of their quarrel with her brother, she has not spoken to him. And she was still angry about their conflict, because it was Kyle's fault that she was sad. But the girl was interrupted by an assistant who said that she should look into the waiting room because there was someone there who was waiting for her. Becca looked at her assistant in surprise, not immediately understanding what she meant. And then she was glad because she thought that it was her brother who had come to talk to her. But it wasn't him, but Alice Libera, who came to see if Becky was okay. Benet didn't believe that Libera had come just like that, immediately asking what Alice wanted, but the deputy head of the Dawn Guild said that she had come simply to support the guild's promising recruit. Alice also said that she was looking for Kyle, but couldn't find him. This news did not please Becca, because she did not want to talk about her brother. Alice was unaware of what had happened between Kyle and Becca, but she sincerely advised them to resolve it all and clear up the situation between them. Becca got angry, asking, "Since when does the vice leader of the guild interfere in family matters?" Alice immediately raised her hands in a surrendering gesture, asking the girl not to get excited, and said that she should just worry about both of them. Becca laughed insincerely, clearly not believing Libera's intentions. Kyle's sister looked straight at Libera, honestly telling her that she didn't like Alice because Becca felt that she was increasingly influencing her brother. Benet voiced her thoughts that Kyle decided to become a hunter precisely after meeting Alice, and it had been very little time since his return, but he was again moving away from his normal life. Becca was annoyed because she didn't want her brother to become a hunter. She didn't understand what he wanted by becoming even stronger, and she didn't know what he was aiming for because Kyle didn't tell her. Alice didn't expect such frankness from Becky. Shocked, she looked at the girl who was getting more and more upset. Becca burst into tears as she was very worried about her brother, because he was now completely different from the one she knew before, and seemed so unfamiliar and distant from her. At this time, the voice of the festival administrator came from the speakers in the corridor, announcing that the Battle of Archers would soon begin, and the participants needed to go to the arena. Becca tried to calm down, telling Alice that she had not intended to show herself to her like that and asking for forgiveness. Alice tried to cheer the girl up, noting that she thought her brother didn't want to change so much. However, Libera understood Kyle, which she told his sister, because the deputy head of the Dawn Guild herself experienced the same suffering. After all, Kyle returned from hell where he could die at any second. And after such an experience, no one would remain the same. But for Becky's sake, according to Alice, Kyle tried to be his old self, and he hid from Becky exactly what he didn't want to show. Benet noted with surprise that it was very strange to hear about her brother from her boss. At the same time, Becky's mood noticeably improved, although she noted that Kai could only behave like this because he considered her unreliable. While with the deputy guild leader Dawn, Kyle clearly feels on equal terms. Alice watched the calmed-down Becca leave for the arena with a neutral gaze. Then she looked back as she felt that she was not alone in the corridor. She noted out loud that she kept thinking about the disappearance of the one who had now overheard their conversation. It was Kyle, and he had told Alice before that he was going to distance himself from his sister. But now he was there, and he never left his sister alone, and Libera asked if Bennett was really that worried about his little sister, to which Kyle pretended that he was there by chance and was just passing by. Alice said understandingly, pretending to accept his lie. Libera noted that the guy now looked very much like the head of Twilight, Max Paxville. Alice, without any bows, closed the distance between them, grabbing the guy by the collar. The girl was outraged. Why couldn't Kyle just tell his sister the truth because not only he had changed, but Becca too, and she was no longer the same as before, and Bennett only managed to ask in shock what happened to the calm Libera. Alice asked if Kyle thought it was better for him to hide his intentions from his sister, and then she answered that no, because if he wanted to say something to Becca, he should say it directly. Libera's fit of anger passed suddenly, and the girl, leaving the guy alone, simply called him to follow her so that he could see the side of his sister that he had never even suspected. The shot marked the beginning of a new competition in the arena. A large, bright flare signaled to the participants that their competition had begun. A multitude of fast-flying objects swooped down into the archer location. These were representatives of the Dawn and Twilight guilds, who, under the cheerful voice of the hosts that the archers' battle had begun and the teams would soon meet in a duel, took their places in the arena. Among them was Becca Bennett, representing her guild, and the girl was determined. Max Paxville took his place in front of the observation deck. The head of the Twilight Guild was looking forward to the competition, hoping that Becca would like the gift he had given her. Becca looked a little sad, not even suspecting what was waiting for her ahead. The members of the Dawn Guild were talking to each other on the headphones, and some of the girls' colleagues had already met their opponents, while others were following them to help. The enemy was spotted ahead, just 200 meters in the 2 o'clock direction, but Becca paid no attention. She remembered the conversation with Libra about Kyle and how he hid himself only in order to be his past self for his sister. This memory angered Becca, and she, calling Kyle a stupid brother, slammed her fist into the wall in anger, leaving a solid dent. Talking to herself, the girl thought angrily that her brother had decided that if he didn't talk to her, he would hide a part of himself, and she believed that he should be honest with her and tell her everything, like Elisa Labora does. Becky's earpiece perked up, telling her that an enemy hunter had been spotted at the entrance to an alley in Area 3, and one of the targets was out of range and another squad had to wait for reinforcements. And she was still angry that Kyle still thought of her as a child, and he was wrong in thinking that he was the only one who had changed in the intervening time. Dawn's communications again reported a new enemy very close, 300 meters away, and warned against using bows and arrows in competitions without reason. The team asked to wait for Becca for backup, but she resolutely stepped out from the edge of the roof, reporting that everything was fine and she would figure it out. The girl activated her abilities and pulled the arrow, aiming. Becca used her sniper skill, targeted shooting, to shoot an arrow covered in magical light using a master sword level martial art full of energy. The magic-filled arrow flew straight towards the designated enemy. The blow hit its target, hitting a member of the Twilight Guild. The player table showed that the Twilight Ranger had been defeated and would no longer be able to continue the fight. Becca, looking down from her perch at her fallen enemy, reported over the radio that the shot had been successful and was praised in return. Recalling her conflict with Kyle, Becca noted out loud that her stupid brother shouldn't look down on her. The girl remembered her childhood, when her parents died, and how she was forced to hear the sympathy of relatives who did not know what to think about her, and thought that the heavens did not care about her, because she lost her entire family in one day, and now there was no one to look after her. Little Becca clenched her little hands into fists, hearing about how her brother's body had never been found. She was already sure then that her brother had not died, and that he was alive somewhere and would soon come for her. Around the same time, changes occurred in their world. The goddess contacted people, warning them of impending danger. This bright woman called on all of humanity to evolve so that they could survive. The revelation of the goddess, monsters, dungeons, hunters, all this in one moment turned the world of ordinary people upside down. Then, Becky's belief that her brother would return did not become empty, but on the contrary, it became stronger, and the girl passed the test to determine the abilities of a hunter, immediately after which she was assigned the class Archer. She herself grew up on state welfare and continued her studies at a hunting academy, where she was bullied by her classmates. After all, she was an orphan, and there was no one to stand up for her, which gave those around her the opportunity to make fun of her. But Becca wasn't weak, so in one of those incidents she was ready to fight back. While those around her laughed, considering her harmless and worthless, Becca remained herself. Even then she was a fighter, and therefore the offender received a strong blow to the face with a tray. Becca suggested to all those who envied her that she was an orphan and was on government support that they go and become orphans themselves, which lessened the ardor of the offenders. Benet would not tolerate insults, inviting anyone who was capable of simply wagging their tongue to follow her to sort this story out. But the offenders didn't have the courage, and Becca, meanwhile, graduated from the academy as the best student and got into the Dawn Guild, which she had dreamed of so much. And every time she encountered obstacles, even those as scary as the blue, red-eyed wolf monster, the girl did not give up. During one of the missions, such a creature cornered her against a tree with the intention of killing her, and was serious about it. But Becca was not going to give up, always finding a way out of difficult and impossible situations. After all, She had not gone through all the suffering in her life so that some little dog could defeat her. Her strength of spirit and intentions were strong, which gave her additional strength. And she defeated all opponents, be it a huge monster or someone else. This is how Becca met Alice Libra personally, who came to her aid on one of the missions with Sylvester, who was then still in Dawn. But they found only Becca, covered in blood, who had already defeated the monster, making sure that the girl did not need help. Alice then asked the name of the persistent newcomer, and Kyle's sister introduced herself, realizing that this could be a turning point for her. Libra then noted that Becky's gaze looked like she was chasing someone, and remarked that Bennett would become stronger and Alice would remember her name. This is how Sister Kayla caught Libora's attention and became the youngest leader of the Dawn Guild group, which greatly annoyed Libora's assistant at the time, Sylvester, but he was not the only one who felt annoyed. Becca actually enjoyed being a group leader for a guild like Dawn, because she just wanted to become as strong as possible. She trained hard, improving herself to last until her brother returned, and did not allow even the slightest weak thought. She brought herself to perfection, spending a lot of time in the training halls. And now, standing on the roof of one of the buildings of the archery arena, she felt a little sad. She remembered her family, looking at the medallion, thinking about how her life had turned out. And then she resolutely closed it, realizing that she wouldn't get a compliment from her brother, because people like her always remain behind the scenes. She understood that from the perspective of her older brother, who studied martial arts, it might seem like she was still lacking a lot. But she couldn't forgive Kyle for treating her like a child, which is why the girl screamed angrily into space. True, she later realized what she had done and felt embarrassed. And then she noted that it had become too quiet around her, and the communications could no longer be heard. Becca activated her earpiece, indicating that she wanted to change the location to a new one, and repeated that she was waiting for a response. And then a premonition made her realize that danger was approaching. A hail of arrows hit the roof, and where Becca stood, pursuing her escape step by step, forcing her to move even faster and change her position. But no matter how she ran and tried to hide from the attack, one of the arrows, filled with red magic, wounded her in the left shoulder. The command to cease fire was immediately given, and the strangers who had appeared on the edge of the roof where Becca had just been, relayed to someone that the target had been found. Becca looked at their faces, a little relieved that the arrow that hit her arm hadn't hit the muscle, but the fact that it had pierced the skin indicated that the rules had been broken. All arrows for the competition had to have a blunt tip, and this could not happen, which meant that her opponents had combat arrows. The first enemy jumped down onto the platform in front of the girl, thinking that she was scared and discouraged, telling her that she shouldn't expect anyone to come to her aid, saying that they had taken care not only to block the radio waves, but also to ensure that the broadcast cameras wouldn't illuminate the area. Becca just laughed, surprised that her rivals thought she would need help. She easily pulled the arrow out of her hand, stating that she couldn't remember ever hoping for something like this in her life. Becca tossed the bloody arrow aside, noting that she had no idea why the guys who had attacked her were making such a fuss just to catch her. And then she drew her bow again, preparing to attack 3 arrows at once and filling them with her blue magical power. Becca firmly stated that all her rivals would come to an end today, inviting these scum to attack her. The leader of the attackers wasn't going to wait for her to shoot them before giving the order to kill Becca. A hail of arrows instantly headed straight for the girl, as if this was the only order the enemy was waiting for. And they immediately sank into the ground, leaving no room for thought. But none of them hit Becca, as she dodged the attack with a deft spinning jump, quickly changing her position. In flight, the girl pulled the next arrow filled with magic, using the archer's skill. It was called the Precise Arrow, and one shot was dangerous enough as the magic was a complex spell seal that spread to more than one point. The Precise Arrow hit several opponents at once, immobilizing them with a precise blow and leaving only the leader. This happened because of the arm injury, because if Becca had not been injured then, she would have hit everyone at once, while the Twilight representative was shocked that from such an unstable position the girl was able to hit 3 at once. He couldn't believe that a girl using competition arrows could wield such destructive power at such a short distance, not understanding how it was possible. The sniper class of archers typically specialized in ultra-long-range shooting. The shooters were able to strike enemies at long range, and the ranger class had speed, which gave an advantage in hand-to-hand combat. And these three classes of high archers were usually, and there was a very big difference between them, since each had its own weakness, and a team of only rangers would give an advantage to Becky, whose class is a sniper. Benet, however, thought that the pain in her arm was not too severe yet, and she was quite capable of coping with the rest. At that moment, one of her undefeated enemies appeared from the side, taking aim at her. The girl was forced to take a stance in order to be able to jump further. It was in the jump that she once again put her sniper shooting skills to use, and her attack seemed successful until the last moment. Her opponent was not the easiest one, as the guy dodged at the last moment and the arrow flew past, without touching him and allowing him to relax for a moment. But the arrow Becca fired was not an ordinary one, because the girl used the circulating arrow skill, and it, not reaching the target, filled with magic, simply turned around in order to hit its target anyway. Becky's opponent jumped to the ground with a curse, landing not far from her. He called Becca an impudent girl before rushing to move the arrow out of the way. But his maneuver failed, and the girl's arrow reached its target, hitting him right in the back. Becca jumped down to the raised area nearby to make sure her blow hit its mark. She was not helpless and she was not harmless, representing her guild with dignity. And now she found herself one-on-one with the leader of the enemy group, and their bows were pointed at each other. Both Becca from the Dawn Guild and the attacker from the Twilight Guild were serious and determined, and neither of them were going to retreat. Suddenly, one of the already defeated, the very first Twilight fighters, whose body glowed with red magic, stood up on his feet. He took aim with lightning speed and released an arrow filled with red magic. She, not encountering any obstacles on her way, quickly rushed forward. And she aimed straight at the unsuspecting Becca, who was aiming at a completely different opponent. Becca managed to notice this sneak attack at the last moment and froze in shock. It was at that moment that the image of her brother appeared in her head, advising her to use the power of martial arts. And this mental support brought her to her senses, allowing her to calm down and feel her strength. She followed her brother's advice and used the martial art he had taught her, filling her healthy arm with golden energy. The next moment, she caught the enemy's unaccounted red magic-filled arrow, surprising him with unprecedented technology because no one had ever shown such results. At this time, Becca closed the distance between herself and the attacker, gathering blue magical flame into her fist. With one precise blow, she hit the head of her barely recovered enemy. Having knocked him out completely, the girl turned to the last enemy. Pointing to the fallen Twilight comrades, she asked him what he would do now that he was alone. She even generously offered him to say his last words, if he had any, and to do it as quickly as possible. After all, she was going to finish him off, and he asked her to stop because he was going to give up. The girl's earpiece was finally restored, and her colleagues from Dawn said they could help her. A blue magic-infused arrow killed Becky's final opponent. 3 of the Dawn appeared on the building next door, and Becca was commended over the comms for doing a great job. The girl confirmed the re-establishment of contact, asking if it was too late for reinforcements, and her colleagues had to apologize, saying that they had no excuse. At that moment, the live broadcast was restored in Becky's sector, and the hosts began animatedly discussing what had happened, while simultaneously reporting that the Dawn Archers had won the 6th survival competition. On the general broadcast screen, Becca's colleagues were seen approaching her. The presenters noted that in the blind spot where there were problems with the broadcast, 4 members of the Twilight Guild were lying in front of Becca. And those 2 gossips who were discussing the girl in the locker room now changed their opinion, saying that her skills were wonderful and she did an excellent job. At this time, Benet was mentally having a dialogue with her brother, noting that she would very much like to cope without his help. She used her sniper skill, vigilance, and looked up at the sky above her with a smile, noting that it was thanks to her brother that she survived. In the sky where she was looking, an ambulance helicopter was circling. And in it sat a smiling Kyle, who had seen everything that happened in the arena live. Alice Labora, sitting in the seat next to him, asked with a smile whether he had seen everything that had happened. Kylie had no choice but to admit that yes, he had seen everything. But Benet wasn't going to give up, pretending that he saw how his sister avoided defeat with the help of the martial arts that he taught her. But Libera interrupted him, shouting that she didn't mean that. Kyle chuckled, reassuring the girl and saying that he was joking, and admitting that Alice was right, and there was a lot he didn't know about his sister. He thought back to their childhood, wondering when Becca had become so strong. He had to accept that his sister was no longer the child from their shared past that he remembered her as. The guy didn't lose his smug look, telling Alice that he shouldn't have expected less from his sister, and Libera had to agree that this was certainly true. But Kyle himself had suggested Becca to use martial arts. Alice could only be glad that it wasn't broadcast, because if the head of the Twilight Guild had seen it, they would have been in trouble. Unaware that Max Paxville had his own broadcast channels and a special Twilight drone was filming everything that happened to Becca. At this time, a shocked Max froze in front of the screen with a glass of drink, trying to comprehend what had just happened in the archery arena. It turned out that he recognized Becky's moves, and now he was amazed to wonder if this was really martial art. The ceremonial event dedicated to the Festival of the Sun continued. In the park not far from the arena where the fights took place, Becca, glowing with joy and pride for her victory, settled down in the company of her brother, asking how he liked her strength. Kyle didn't want to acknowledge her victory and merits, so she pretended that everything was within the usual framework, sipping coffee, to which his sister noted that he should have taken the lid off the cup since he was pretending to drink something. Becca couldn't help but mention that in the eyes of her brother, as the strongest immortal in the universe, she probably lacked a lot, and admitted that she used the power of martial arts to win, noting that her internal energy was also running out. But Kyle interrupted her monologue, saying that she was wrong. The guy returned the glass to the table, continuing to talk about how his sister was strong, and that she had all of this thanks to her hard work, which allowed her to master both martial arts and gain high skills as a hunter. Kyle looked down, asking his sister to forgive him for hiding so much from her, because he wanted to be her brother like before he came to Murim. Before this fight, the boy did not realize that he considered her the same little and innocent sister as in their childhood. But now he finally saw how she had grown up and become much more mature. Kyle and Becca were sitting at a table surrounded by other families with children, and the girl shared with her brother that lately she wanted to find the person who caused the disaster that destroyed their family, and admitted that this was the reason she became a hunter. The girl thought that if she reached the highest level, the one where the goddess was located, she would be able to get at least some kind of hint. But during this time, she herself did not notice how she plunged into the games of hunters and dungeons with her head, forgetting about the primary goal. Becca admitted that everything that happened to her did not seem particularly difficult to her, and that is why she got to this point. But she had no desire to remember the past, so she told her brother that everything was in the past, and holding out her little finger to her brother, as in childhood, she asked him to promise only one thing: never to leave her again. Kyle replied that it was obvious that he was not going to leave her again, but Becca disagreed. Continuing to extend her little finger, she shared that in the last month she felt as if he was hiding something from her, and therefore the girl felt very lonely. So now she asked him not to hide anything from her in the future. Kyle looked at his grown-up sister with a smile and warmth. Extending his little finger and sealing their vows, he confirmed that he was never going to leave her alone again. After the vows, Kyle turned to his slightly confused sister, saying that there was something else Becca needed to know. With a slightly condescending smile, Kyle corrected his sister on how she called him, repeating once again that his title sounded like Immortal Sword Emperor, and she should remember that well. Becca looked at her brother at first, confused, thinking he was talking about something serious. But when she realized that that was all, and he didn't want to tell her anything else, she felt annoyed. Meanwhile, an announcement from the festival organizers came over the loudspeaker to the spectators, informing them that the great battle was to begin in an hour, and everyone was called upon to hurry to the start. Kyle stood up from the table, telling Becca that he had to go, and she wished him luck, asking him if he was serious about going in the clothes he was wearing. The guy just shrugged his shoulders in slight surprise, clarifying that she was comfortable and he liked everything, and then asked Becky if the last guys who attacked her seemed strange to her, because from the outside it seemed as if they were there on purpose and were targeting her specifically. Becca wasn't surprised by her brother's question, nor by the idiots who were going to set a trap for her, explaining that if both the Twilight and Dawn guilds were in the dungeons at the same time, then such skirmishes happened often, and although this time everything looked like a normal skirmish, what was strange was that they attacked her openly. But the girl didn't feel particularly worried about this. On the contrary, she proudly replied that it happened because she was considered a pro from the Dawn Guild, and that was why they wanted to get rid of her faster. To which Kyle cautiously and mentally noted that his sister was definitely a pro at kicking her interlocutor's ears. But Becky's answer didn't give him confidence, nor did it reassure him, so he continued to think about it. He remembered the sign warning that a chained heavenly warrior was going to take everything from him, and hoped that these events were not connected. Kyle made it to his third locker room, where they were already waiting for him. Richard Fraza greeted Kyle with Alice Libra standing behind him, saying that he had heard a lot about Kyle from the latter. He shook Kyle's hand vigorously, declaring that he would be taking the lead in the great battle and he looked forward to it, also mentioning that it was a pleasure to meet the hunter. But his attention didn't stay on Kyle for long, and the head of the Dawn Guild turned to the other hunters, asking how they were doing, leaving Kyle and Alice puzzled by his behavior. Benet mentally asked Alice if this was really the chapter she told him about, and Libra asked him not to look down on him, since Richard was level 60. The head of the Dawn Guild himself was talking to other hunters at this time, encouraging everyone, although Kyle mentally noted that even if he was level 60, he was still weaker than Libra, and she had nothing to say. Richard, meanwhile, managed to talk with the other participants and said goodbye, leaving the locker room, and wishing all the hunters good luck in preparing for the competition, while Alice continued to conduct a mental dialogue with Kyle, who said that he would not use martial arts during the battle, and the girl should have understood this herself. The other hunters at this time bowed respectfully to thank the guild leader for his support, and Kyle reminded the deputy leader of Dawn to forget that highly advanced martial arts were indistinguishable from magic. But Kyle had one more message for Alice, thanking her for pushing him to talk to his sister and making peace with Becca. Alice smiled, happily accepting this news and saying that she was glad about this development of events. The girl sincerely wished good luck to a pleased Kyle. The other hunters from the locker room called out to Kyle, asking if he was an ally of the Dawn Guild, saying that they had already heard a lot about him from the deputy guild leader and asked him to take care of them as the vanguard. But these hunters were not interesting to Kyle, nor was their admiration, so the guy quickly lost interest in them, thinking about what happened to his sister. He came to the conclusion that no matter how hard he tried to explain the actions of the Twilight group, he could not give up the idea that the attackers did not act by chance, but followed someone's instructions. And just when Kyle decided that there was only one person who could give such an order, he appeared in their locker room. A guest came to the hunters of the Dawn Guild. It was the head of the Twilight Guild, Max Paxville, along with his secretary Sam, who brazenly asked if he had disturbed the boys. Kyle wasn't surprised by this, although he remained wary, thinking that if that threatening message had been sent to him by a heavenly warrior, then he couldn't rule out the possibility that Max Paxville, who was under the Heavenly Warrior's command, might have been involved. Meanwhile, Max explained that he came because the fight between Dawn was friendly, which meant he could just drop in to say hello. The other hunters generally agreed that it was possible, although they recalled that the relationship between the two guilds was not friendly. Max Paxville merely chuckled at the remark, not intending to pretend any further. With his arms outstretched, he asked as if he was the master of the situation if he was really pretending so badly, and agreed that the Dawn Hunters were right, and he came here because he heard that a great man would be with them, and Max came to spy, which made the boys feel uncomfortable. Max, meanwhile, approached Kyle, extending his hand and saying that he had heard a lot about Beckett, and it would be nice to meet him. Paxville put on an innocent and happy expression, clarifying that they were seeing each other for the first time. Kyle, who had been keeping a close eye on the man from Twilight, didn't buy into such hospitality, remaining on guard. He agreed that this was their first meeting and shook the hand of the Twilight Guildmaster with a serene smile. Paxville was listening carefully to the space and the guy in front of him at this time, noting that he did not feel the heavenly harmony of pure art. This worried the head of the Twilight Guild very much because he was sure that it was Kyle who taught Becca martial arts. But if it was not Bennett, then how could a girl who was definitely not in Murim learn the technique that helped her win? Kyle noticed at this time that although he didn't know Max, he knew his worker Sam, who was standing at the door, and the guy greeted Kyle with an embarrassed smile. Benet admitted to Max that he wanted to meet him through Sam, but remembered that the conversation didn't go well then. Also, Kyle was not going to keep silent about what happened to his sister, mentioning that Becca had caused enough trouble for the Twilight Hunters in the Archer battle. But this did not affect Max, and he, on the contrary, mentioned that he himself wanted to say this, summing up that Bennett's sister had, as expected, excellent skills. Kyle went into an open threat, telling Max that Paxville should remember that Bennett would not forget what happened, and the head of Twilight would pay for what happened. But he was not at all afraid of this threat, saying that he would look forward to their meeting. Bennett had no intention of continuing the conversation any further, as it was time for him to go, so the boy turned to leave, leaving a final comment that Paxville really should wait. In his mind, Kyle was prioritizing, deciding for himself that whether the attack on his sister was related to the Celestial Warrior or not was only the second most important fact, while the first was the incident of the attack itself. So Kyle promised that he would give Max an interesting show that would definitely not disappoint him, because Bennett was going to erase the Twilight Guild from this world. In the central arena, everything was just ready for the beginning of the next stage of the Sun Festival. The presenter turned to the audience with anticipation, announcing that the moment they had been waiting for was approaching, while her colleague was again less emotional and skeptical about her. They announced that the main event of the Sun Festival, which does not require words, should begin right now. It was the Great Guild Battle of Dawn and Dusk that was finally about to begin. In the center of the large stadium, where all the events of the holiday took place, a special arena was prepared, and hundreds of thousands of spectators eagerly awaited the representatives of the guilds. The first one to appear on the field was Kyle, and the hosts announced that he was the hunter who would represent the Dawn side, and he was a super rookie who had attracted a lot of attention due to the personal offer of partnership from the Dawn Vice Guildmaster, Alice Labora. He was announced as the leader of the Martial Arts Guild, Hunter Kyle Bennett. The first emotional host told the audience that the appearance of a hunter from outside the guild in the Great Battle was the first time at the Festival of the Sun, and she, like other viewers, wondered who he was and why he was invited to Dawn. The second calm host responded that the level, class, achievements, and all information about this hunter was hidden, mentally thinking that he wanted to file a complaint against his colleague, and out loud continuing to say that since nothing is known about Kyle Benny, this could psychologically affect the enemy. Meanwhile, Kyle's enemy was also announced. It turned out to be the leader of the Twilight Advance Squad, who, upon Kyle's approach, immediately informed him that the rumors about the hunter were true, and that he really did have an impudent face. It was a genius mage of the Twilight Guild, named Flame Charisma and Flame of the Fire Dragon, a young guy whose name was Stephen Gore, who immediately informed Kyle that he was going to incinerate him to a crisp. Kyle looked at his opponent with a sneer, mentally wondering if he was ashamed to use such a strange name as Fiery Charisma, and out loud noting that all of his names, including the Flame of the Fire Dragon, could sound absolutely normal in Miram, but looked strange here. The hosts announced once again that it was Kyle Bennett who would fight Stephen Gore, and the first match of the Great Battle would begin right now. Max Paxville, who was watching the hunters, smirked smugly. The head of the Twilight Guild was mentally glad that his protege Stephen knew exactly what he needed to do, namely to never leave his opponent alive, while trying to reveal all of his abilities as much as possible. As if sensing the attention of the guild leader, Stephen turned to the podium, remembering what the leader had told him. But turning to his opponent, he noticed that Kyle had already soared into the air, and the fire mage was surprised at what kind of show was happening in front of him, just as the presenters were surprised by Kyle's behavior, because Bennett immediately revealed his class, flying quite high. Levitation was a skill of sorcerers, and the Dawn Guild Hunter openly revealed his top class, which was unexpected by everyone. The hosts noted that Hunter Bennett also demonstrated his high control over magic by maintaining such a height, wondering if this was his strategy, and Richard asked Labora the same question, asking if Bennett had any plan at all. Alice, who was looking at the arena with concentration, was not happy with this turn of events, answering the guild leader that she did not know if Kyle had a plan, assuming that he just wanted to do it, and that was all. Kyle, meanwhile, assessed the opponent in front of him with a careful gaze. He had already realized that Stephen's level was 50th, which meant that he was approximately the same as the previous head of the Dawn Guild, Mr. Khan. Therefore, if he immediately uses martial arts, then the mage will not make a normal opponent, but if he only uses hunter skills for battle, then the fire mage will be good for something. Kyle realized that he was currently at level 53, And although he was rapidly increasing his power level, he had no real experience as a hunter. Kyle also turned his gaze to the podium with the guild leaders, realizing that not everything was so simple. And he was right. Max Paxville was watching him closely, and now Kyle had to take that into account when choosing his actions. But overall, this did not upset the hunter, and he was amused that Max so much wanted to know more about Benet. Well, Kyle was ready to give this opportunity to the head of the Twilight Guild, saying out loud that he could watch for at least 100 years until his eyes dried out, while he concentrated blue magical power around himself. Sending this magical flow towards his opponent, Bennett finished his thought by saying that he still wouldn't show the head of the Twilight Guild what he wanted to see, meaning the power of martial arts. The hosts continued to comment on what was happening in the arena, noting that a large number of energy spheres created by Kyle were literally raining down on the enemy, but he was trying to protect himself from them with a fire barrier. They also note that this kind of technique, using mana spheres without attacking, is a base-class mage skill, and Steven is surprised by this, and he assumes that such an attack from the opponent is an attempt to test the waters. Steven gathers his magic, and under the comments of the hosts, he transforms it into a flaming whip, waving which he tries to reach his opponent. The Twilight Guild hunter was not overconfident, and he understood that since Kyle was a mage, he definitely had to come up with something to win. He remembered that mages were divided into 3 classes, and those who were engaged in non-combat activities, making skill cubes and items, were called craftsmen. Mages who specialized in combat and endowed mana with special attributes were wizards. And the last class was called sorcerers, and they were the embodiment of the phenomenon and concept of magic, as they were closer to people with supernatural abilities than to magicians, and could use teleportation or flight. In combat, these usually took up positions in the rear rather than the front lines, and were responsible for supporting roles and also had some kind of secret weapon. Steven jerked forward, deciding to attack. After all, it was not in his nature to stand and wait for the enemy to attack him. The Twilight Mage used his power to gather a lot of hot flames into a huge sphere in a short time. On his next move, he sent the flaming ball towards his opponent, urging him to bring out his trump card if he had one. Or Kyle would have to experience the hellish flames of his magic, which was approaching with terrible force. Kyle only had time to cross his arms in front of him in a defensive gesture. A huge fireball caught up with him, immediately exploding into a bright flash of fire in the arena, with the hosts commenting that this was exactly what was expected from the flame of a fire dragon. It was not just a fireball, but a magnificent connection between the fire flame magic and Steven's physical strength, and the explosion made the head of the Dawn Guild worry about the condition of the hunter who represented them, while the hosts added that Steven was the kind of hunter who was known for his fighting style, which was so pronounced in close combat, completely untypical for the mage class. Kyle, meanwhile, was unharmed, noting that he thought he was the only mage from Murim. It was clear that where Bennett had stood in the arena, there was a whole crater from the explosion, but Kyle himself was not hurt, continuing to note out loud that Steven's thinking was somewhat similar to his, Kyle's, and this fact slightly spoiled Bennett's mood. But Kyle's words had no effect on Steven. On the contrary, the magician again gathered his power into a fiery whirlwind around himself, completely concentrated on his task. Gathering the magical flame into a ball in his hands, the Twilight representative again addressed Kyle with a warning that he would be crawling around on the floor in vain. After all, Steven was going to use his special skill of mastering flames. Urging Kyle to show everything he had, Gore sent a huge blast of fire made with the skill March of the Fire Dragon straight at his opponent. And this skill was very spectacular, since all the flames that obeyed the magician concentrated and materialized the figure of a fire dragon, which was now rushing towards Kyle. But this attack did not frighten Benet. On the contrary, he smiled contentedly, saying that Steven had surprised him, and since he had asked for a trump card, he would get it. And the next moment, Kyle simply extended his hand with a clenched fist and an extended thumb forward and turned his thumb down. The dragon, meanwhile, had no intention of stopping and continued, demolishing everything in its path to approach Benny. Only when the fire magic reached Kyle it couldn't break through the barrier that formed at the guy's outstretched hand, and all the fire simply split into 2 parts, passing by him and not touching him at all. Steven looked at the boy in shock as his attack did absolutely no damage, not understanding who was in front of him. And why was Kyle able to stop such a powerful attack with just one humiliating gesture, which was usually used to demonstrate the defeat of an opponent? The presenters stood frozen in amazement on the podium, not understanding what they had just seen in front of them. After all, what happened was incredible, as Kyle was able to avoid the fire dragon attack using, in their opinion, fast movement, although it remained surprising to them that he was still able to survive. The audience was also confused and shocked, as they did not understand how the hero managed to survive, because it looked like he was fried. And while everyone around was perplexed, they did not notice the great magical potency the guy used to protect himself, continuing to assume that he had used magic perfectly by simply snapping his fingers. Even the head of the Dawn Guild turned to Alice in bewilderment and asked what had happened in the arena, not understanding what they had all seen. Alice remembered Kyle's words about how no one could really tell the difference between his power and magic, wondering how he had managed to fool so many people right now, but answering the leader that she didn't understand what was going on either. Max Paxville remained outwardly cool after Kyle's show, but it was a deception. In fact, the Twilight Guildmaster was furious that his man couldn't defeat Kyle. Steven himself was also shocked by what happened, because now the hosts, as well as all the viewers, knew that his most special move, March of the Fire Dragon, was completely useless against Kyle Benet. The Twilight Mage couldn't believe that it didn't work and his special move failed, while that cheeky guy remained unharmed. So, calling upon his magical power again, Steven rushed towards his opponent with a cry, intending to attack him again. Kyle taunted him, blocking his punch with one hand, not understanding why he was so worked up, and offering to show him something as consolation. But the Twilight Guild hunter refused to listen to him, gaining momentum and pushing off the ground in a jump. Steven aimed straight at Kyle, wanting to crush him and also shut him up, but he easily dodged such an attack. The Fire Mage became so angry and furious that he went mad with rage, launching a series of vicious attacks, hoping to reach his opponent. But Kyle easily ignored them, dodging and easily not giving in to his opponent. The hosts were happy to comment on such an exciting and completely atypical battle for magicians, because in fact, Steven switched to hand-to-hand combat, which, however, did not give him an advantage, and this type of battle was atypical between magicians. The Fire Mage abruptly closed the distance between him and Kyle, but missed Bennett's maneuver, not understanding where his opponent had disappeared to, while Kyle informed him that Steven had held up well, but had made one important mistake, spoiling his mood, and this mistake would cost him dearly. So Kyle wasn't going to stand aside and found the magician's weak point while he was open. Plus, Bennett noticed that Steven was clearly too young, since he had completely forgotten about his legs, which in hand-to-hand combat should have been the center of gravity, and he so stupidly lifted them off the ground. Therefore, Benet was able to deliver his blow, from which the Fire Mage flew back several meters without much difficulty. And Kyle noted that he should correct his stupid habit of raising his shoulders too high when striking, and concentrate more carefully on his opponent. Steven, lying in a cloud of dust on the ground and recovering from the last blow, still couldn't understand how he got it, asking how Kyle did it. Kyle closed the distance between them, stopping and hovering over his opponent who was sitting on the ground, blocking the light, smiling as he said that he had studied martial arts for a long time. Benet leaned over to Steven, who was sitting on the ground, admonishingly noting that the Fire Mage had too little experience. In an instant, Bennett's smiling and good-natured face turned sinister, and he threateningly asked if the Fire Mage had understood everything from his words, also asking if he still thought that abilities alone were enough to win. Steven felt that the hunter fighting for Twilight was mocking him, because Bennett also noted that his words clearly hurt the pride of the Fire Mage, showing that the techniques of the mage, who considered himself the strongest, were not enough and that he was, in fact, a weakling. These words angered Steven, causing him to feel furious, and he shouted that he was going to incinerate Bennett, causing Kyle to be surprised at his stupidity. Benet jumped away from the enraged guy, who had surrounded himself with a fireball, to a safe distance with great speed and incredible ease. Steven turned his magic into fire with no intention of stopping, because his rage and anger also gave him strength, and he, even having exhausted his mana, was going to burn Kylo to ashes. The Fire Mage summoned the fire dragons again, only this time there were many more of them, and they all formed into a large fiery avalanche as he once again used his true power to attack Kyle. This skill was called the Fire Dragon's Fury March, which was completely in keeping with his state of anger and desire to destroy Kyle. And now all these dragons were heading towards Benet in a furious attack, intending to deal with him once and for all. Kyle admired Steven's attack with a slight grin, but the guy didn't look scared or shocked. Even seeing the mouth of one of the fire monsters in front of him, Bennett only noted to himself that in order to repel this attack, he would need to put in a little of his own strength. Meanwhile, the hosts and spectators watched as the fire dragons surrounded Kyle from all sides, enclosing him in a burning cage. In addition, there were so many dragons, and they were flying all over the stadium, which caused concern that they could burn the entire stadium to the ground. The female host suggested that since the flames, almost like an explosion, covered the entire stadium, Kyle would have to sweat to cope with such a strong blow. Alice Labora, who was watching the fight from the guild representative's box, did not take her eyes off the arena. In the words of the host, that such a strong attack from Steven drove Kyle into a corner because no one knew what could be done to counter such a merciless attack. But then the hosts were able to see something in the tongues of flame. What all the viewers were able to see was amazing, because in the epicenter of the attack, under the blue dome, Kyle stood unharmed, and the presenters were surprised and admired Bennett's resilience, because even such a powerful attack from Steven could not break the barrier of the magic of the hunter from Dawn. Kyle just smirked at Steven's latest attempt to get to him, noting that he was irritating him, and that such attacks weren't too hard to fight off. His hand waves easily dispersed the flames, and the guy himself said that while his body was immortal, he was not afraid of either heat or cold, and it would not be easy to deal with him. The fire dragons began to lose their power, dispersing into the air. Kyle was once again able to handle Steven's attack without putting in any effort, and the arena was filled with the sight of the fire dragons failing to cope with their task. And the next moment, the barrier around Kyle burst, and with a gust of air and magic it dispersed around, extinguishing the surrounding fire. Benet stood in the streams of his magic, tinged with a life-giving blue, his arm outstretched again, his palm clenched into a fist, his thumb pointing downwards, promising Steven defeat, and he reported out loud that the fire mage's pathetic attack had failed to touch him. The presenters were amazed, because Kyle easily dealt with such a terrifying force in an instant and simply took and easily defeated all the fire dragons. And now everyone wondered what kind of power he had and what it was, assuming that he controls gravity. The Twilight Fire Mage fell to his knees in shock, not understanding how this had happened or why it was even possible. Kyle loomed over his stunned and unresponsive opponent as the hosts continued to ponder whether his power was truly gravity, and if so, they had no idea that this type of magic was so powerful, and for them, as seasoned observers of such competitions, it was something new. They admitted that his power was beyond imagination and did not understand how a man could use gravity so skillfully, doubting that Kyle was a beginner while Bennett prepared his own attack, as the boy had already concentrated his power into a blue magical ball in his palm, telling Steven that their battle was more fun than Bennett had imagined. Kyle surrounded his opponent with his magic, grabbing him in order to deliver another crushing blow. A full-force punch from Bennett to the stomach knocked the wind out of the fire mage. He was thrown several meters across the arena after Benet's melee attack. Kyle looked at his defeated opponent with a smirk, saying that it was time to end their fight. Guildmaster of the Twilight Guild, Max Paxville, asked his deputy Sylvester in the lodge who would be next from their guild, and he said that it was Dustin Hammer, and this answer pleased Paxville. Max was angry about losing his fire mage, so he ordered Sylvester to pass on his words to Dustin that he should use it. Dustin Hammer was a knight called Twilight Spear. This knight was practically invincible, and his weapon, which was a spear, always struck down everyone from the Dawn Guild. The hosts were delighted to see Dustin Hammer enter the arena, introducing him not only as the Spear of Twilight, but also as the Mage Killer, and the knight truly seemed invincible in his shining steel armor. The female presenter asked her colleague if Dustin Hammer, judging by his nickname, had never lost, and he said that in general the warrior class has a higher percentage of victories compared to mages. At the same time, the presenter noted that this does not mean that knights are stronger, because magicians may have more techniques that remained secret and were not known to anyone. Kyle, who heard some of the words voiced by the hosts, grinned and flexed his fists in front of him, saying that he would be looking forward to their duel, because Mage Killer sounded like a challenge to him, and Bennett also appreciated his opponent's knightly costume. Max Paxville, who was watching the opponents in the arena with his deputy, noted with a grin that Kyle was too relaxed, but in vain, because this time everything would be different. Because while Bennett belonged to the magician class, he could not defeat Dustin Hammer. The hosts announced that the second duel of the Great Battle of the Sun Festival was beginning, and Dustin immediately called upon his power, distinguished by the color purple, and directed it into the spear. He used his knight skill, which was called enhancement, and his weapon immediately became several times larger and more powerful, and the knight himself rushed to attack. The spear written with magic was indeed a deadly weapon, which Kyle was able to dodge at the last moment, and the place where he stood was destroyed. The hosts shared with the audience that Dustin activated all possible upgrades for his spear and immediately went on the attack, while Kyle was assessing the situation, clarifying whether his opponent was going to break through his front and noting that the knight was quite fast. But Benet himself wasted no time either, using his power to form a magical blue ball in his hand, while saying that his opponent's strategy actually didn't matter to him. The Dawn Guild Hunter also attacked without warning, like Dustin, firing 3 energy blasts at Hammer at once, telling him that he considered him to be as much of a dud as his previous opponent. All of Kyle's shots hit their target, hitting Dustin straight away. But this did not cause him any damage, and through the dust from the previous blow, he again rushed to attack Bennett. Kyle didn't expect such a dash from the knight, so he was surprised when he almost collided nose-to-nose with him. The Dawn Mage had to use his signature move of fast movement to jump away from the knight who had closed the distance so quickly and unexpectedly. Kyle was pleased to note that his current opponent was not only fast but also tough, and had a will of steel, deciding that aerial combat would be the best choice for this battle, so the mage took to the air again. But Dustin wasn't that simple, as the next moment he used a knight skill, pushing off the field with his spear. This was enough to provide support so that Hammer could also easily rise up, even higher than his opponent. This allowed Dustin to quickly attack Kyle, who was not expecting a trick, from a completely unexpected side, from above. Hammer's skill was called a jump attack, and Kyle managed to put his shield up against the knight's spear at the very last moment. But Benet didn't expect that the strength of his shield wouldn't be enough. The protective layer in front of him began to crack, not saving the magician at all. The residual force from the Twilight Knight's attack sent Kyle flying back onto the field, and the hosts reported that the attack was incredible, as Dustin simply didn't give Bennett a chance to fly, attacking the Dawn representative without any hesitation. The hosts also took pity on those responsible for the ring, because after the battle they will have to fix everything, while Kyle, who left a dent under himself and was slowly coming to his senses, tried to remember the last time he felt something like this, and someone actually slammed him into the ground. Dustin Hammer wasted no time in rushing towards Kyle, not intending to give him a break. Benet was clearly uncomfortable as he rose from the ground, while thinking that if he were allowed to use martial arts, he would have finished his opponent in a second. Hammer stopped in front of his opponent, preparing for another attack, to which Bennett called him a stubborn bastard. This angered Kyle, so he used his magic and his signature gesture of defeat, asking if this was what the knight wanted to see. Immediately, a huge magical force fell upon the knight, not allowing him to stand on his feet and pressing him and his spear to the ground. At the same time, Max Paxville was calmly enjoying a drink in the box, completely unconcerned by what was happening on the field, and not paying attention to the words of the presenters that Benet had used an unknown skill again. Guildmaster Twilight, on the contrary, grinned, as if his knight's defeat made him happy, while the hosts noted that Dustin Hammer, who had not stopped since the start of the duel, was now unable to move. However, this was a temporary effect, and now the knight was able to raise his spear and thrust it into the ground. Overcoming the power of magic, he slowly moved, trying to raise his head. And soon he succeeded, and the knight's eyes glowed with a red, magical flame. And around the knight himself, a cloud of his magical purple energy appeared, which helped him rise, which delighted both the spectators and the presenters, not believing their eyes. Kyle was as amazed as everyone else that the knight was able to do it under such intense pressure, and Dustin asked if Bennett really thought he could stop him with gravity, and then said that it was his turn now. Purple strands of magic enveloped Hammer's entire body, which advised Kyle to prepare for his next strike. But such phrases and effects did not make the desired impression on Benet, and he asked what he was talking about. Kyle concentrated his magic on the tip of his index finger, waving it in front of him, clarifying when he even said he was using gravity. Knight Dustin Hammer felt Bennett's next sudden blow at the same moment, completely not understanding how it happened. The Twilight Guild hunter was dragged across the arena floor with great force, leaving a huge crack in the floor behind him, and he was only able to stop when he crashed into the wall. Hammer let out a huge groan as he tried to comprehend what had happened, and the force of the impact even cracked his helmet. Alice Libera and Richard Fraza stared at their own hunter in shock, clearly not expecting this. Max Paxville also finally took the fight seriously, looking up from his drink and watching with his mouth open as his knight was simply kicked around the field. Both the spectators and the hosts of the Sun Festival did not understand what had happened. Kyle stood calmly in place while his opponent was dragged not only through the ground but also along the wall of the arena, and was now sitting on the ground with his head down and coming to his senses. The presenters again wondered if it was gravity or some other ability, wondering what skill Benet had used. Hammer, having received such a blow, realized that his opponent, although very young, was also very strong, so now it was not surprising that he lasted until this moment. Benet at this time closed the distance, approaching the knight frozen in the wall, reporting that his power was not gravity, as everyone around believed, but attraction and repulsion. Kyle calmly shared this information, saying that this was his main skill that he had obtained with sweat and blood, and it was related to the conductivity of yin and yang, and it could be either a main or passive skill of the highest rarity, a plus, the highest treasure that even makes one doubt its existence, and the mastery level was B-, which meant that it could only be used without being affected by external factors, and this skill itself was related to magical properties, adding an attribute of attraction or repulsion to magical power. So Benet pulled a small stone that had rolled away from the wall towards himself, saying that if his opponent knew the basics of physics, he should know that gravity is the force that attracts an object to something, and repulsion is the repulsive force. Kyle threw a pebble with just a small movement of his finger right into the knight's crumpled helmet, saying that it was difficult to explain in detail and that he should understand the essence. The guy continued to explain to the knight that he used force in the direction he wanted, and that's why the enemy flew there. But Dustin interrupted Kyle, saying that the magician was wrong and causing him to question. With some effort, the knight climbed out of the crack in the wall and rose to his feet, filling himself with the purple power of his magic once again. He was once again enveloped in a cloud of power, and his eyes glowed red, and he explained that Kyle shouldn't have told, and explained his weakness to the knight, and Dustin used his true skill, pointing his hand at Kyle. Max Paxville, sitting in the box and knowing about Libera's abilities, mentally addressed Alice, asking if she knew why Dustin Hammer was called the Magician Killer. The girl did not expect such impudence from the head of the Twilight Guild, but she was even more shocked by the answer because Paxville said that Dustin had a special skill, the very one that Max ordered him to use, and told the girl that if Bene had nothing but magic, he was finished. At this time, Kyle, amazed by the knight's speed and strength, stared in shock at Hammer's approaching magic. Dustin's hand, filled with purple magical power, seemed to block out all the light, rising like a bright shadow above Kyle's face. Max Paxville saw no point in hiding, triumphantly declaring out loud that Benet would die right there in the arena. Alice Libera turned to the arena in shock, not believing the words of the head of the Twilight Guild. Kyle Benet was thrown back by the knight's power, and a blue information board immediately appeared in front of his face, shockingly written, as Dustin Hammer cast a counterspell. The blue sign in front of the Dawn Guild mage's face was a system notification that informed him that he was prohibited from using magic for the next 10 seconds due to his knight abilities. Kyle, sitting on the ground with a system notification in front of his eyes, tried to understand what was happening because he found himself under a direct blow from the already swinging Twilight Guild knight. Before the fight, it was this counterspell that Mac Paxville gave the order to Dustin through Sylvester. Hammer also noted that it was not a skill he wanted to use in public and questioned why he had to go that far. Sylvester replied that the leader of the Twilight Guild, Kyle Benet, believed that he was hiding something, and none of them knew what it was, but a mage who had the power of attraction was too dangerous. That's why the head of the Twilight Guild gave the order to his knight to kill Bennett. And so Kyle found himself in this situation, where the counterspell blocked his magical abilities, as reported by the system notification, and the knight swung for the finishing blow to kill the guy. Benet looked at the blue information sign with confusion, not understanding what it was. Twilight Guild. Knight Dustin Hammer attacked the mage, intending to carry out the leader's order. Kyle miraculously managed to jump to the side as a terrifyingly powerful spear strike fell on the spot where he had been standing a few seconds ago. Dustin noted that he could see Kyle was very surprised and informed him that his true skill was the counterspell, and that it was what temporarily disabled the ability to use magic. Kyle had to quickly dodge the next blow, while Hammer continued to talk to him enthusiastically, noting that without magic he had no chance of winning. Spectators and presenters watched the events in the arena closely, noting that the moment the fight ended unexpectedly changed the opponent's places, and the mysterious skill used by Hammer suppressed Bennett's power. While the hosts were wondering what kind of skill it was, Guildmaster Dawn was seriously worried about the balance of power in the arena, and Guildmaster Twilight smugly commented that his knight was stupid and honest by nature, and could not hold back his anger in front of someone who had secretly attacked him with magic. Max Paxville, under Labora's frightened cry, continued to state that his fighter himself could not even dream of such a skill. But Alice wasn't distracted by this chatter, but was worried about Kyle, and mentally tried to contact him, conveying information that he should run away from there, and that the competition no longer mattered, urging Bennett to give up. Kyle heard her, as well as the fact that she asked him not to use martial arts, but Bennett was not going to run away or give up. Dustin heard these words spoken by the guy and immediately pointed his spear at him. Hammer informed him that he would neither be able to escape nor surrender, and activated his skill, increasing his attack power first to 2, then 3, and then 4. He concentrated a huge amount of power on the tip of his spear, which could destroy an entire house, increasing it to 5 points, and this was a full charge of magic, and then Hammer asked if Kyle could withstand such a blow without magical power. And without giving Bennett a chance to think, the knight jumped up. He accompanied his attack with a cry of death for Benet, attacking the motionless guy. Kyle only calmly and rhetorically asked whether he could really die. The knight's spear, filled with purple magical power, was unstoppably directed towards the magician. Benet was able to easily summon his true power, bewilderedly noting that wishing him dead was nonsense. The entire space around Kyle began to vibrate with a blue magical field. Both Alice Libera and Max Paxville, who visited Murim, immediately felt a response from this energy. Guildmaster Dawn, seeing that his deputy was unwell, immediately called her excitedly, asking if everything was okay with her and asking why she suddenly screamed, while not only Alice but also Max Paxville was experiencing unpleasant sensations. Only the Guildmaster Twilight immediately realized that it was the heavenly harmony of pure art that suddenly began to resonate, although he could not recognize the energy itself. Mac felt not only the power from Murim, but also large and frightening streams of energy that he had never felt before, as his knight continued to advance in his attack on Kyle. Only Dustin didn't feel any power that could come from Kyle, so he didn't change anything in his strategy. Until Kyle used it on him, catching the knight off guard. Hammer suddenly stopped, not understanding how this could be possible, thinking that it couldn't be magic. After all, his counterspell was still in effect, but he was stopped by a multitude of chains that locked him in place. The knight found himself wrapped in chains and suspended in the air, indignantly trying to understand what kind of skill this was. Kyle, who had risen into the air again and was hovering in front of Hammer, explained that this was not a skill, but martial arts, and if Dustin was interested in what it was, he should just ask the head of his guild later. A smug Benet felt in control again, and said he almost reverted to his old self of running and hiding, which was exactly what Alice had suggested he do, and Kyle hated it. The magician noticed that Dustin was very surprised and explained that only Hammer could see and feel his power now. Benet also said that the energy that bound the knight's body was a type of sword skill called the Spirit Sword, and it could only be used if one reached the 40th inner level, called the Phenomenon of the Spirit Sword. Kyle explained that although both names contain the word sword, it does not symbolize a bladed weapon but human will, and if you reach such a level that just by thinking you can kill people or separate heaven from earth. The mage waved his finger again, as he had done the previous times he attacked Hammer, and noted that the sword use he had described was too boring. The magic and chains that bound Hammer transported him straight to Benet in an instant. He just swung his sword, about to make the next blow, informing the knight that he must teach the younger ones a lesson. Kyle put in enough magic power, hitting the knight right in the chest. Dustin Hammer was defeated because Benet's powers were not comparable to the knight's capabilities. The body of the Twilight Guild's defender flew into the sky from Bennett's blow, and Kyle himself rejoiced, wondering if Paxville was watching this, because the head of the Twilight Guild had been watching him the entire fight. But Kyle didn't care, and Max could watch as much as he wanted, because what the magician had just shown was true martial arts. Benet then activated his power for a new swing, since he had not yet defeated his opponent, and now used a whirlwind strike. The magician soared into the air and dealt another blow to the knight, slamming him into the ground of the arena. It was a complete victory of the magician over the knight. The leader of the Twilight Guild was shocked by what had just happened before his eyes. The hosts, as well as the viewers, were also perplexed because everyone was sure that Kyle's magical skills were stopped. But literally in a second the situation changed, and Dustin Hammer was now unable to resist, and everyone wondered if this was related to the power that they could feel. The hosts also announced that the duel was over and that the medical team should hurry to the defeated Twilight Knight. And Kyle felt inspired and happy, as he had not used martial arts for a long time and missed the power he felt from them. The hosts announced that Dustin Hammer was out and Kyle Bennett was the winner of the second match of the Great Battle of the Sun Festival. Later, the news report said that after the fight, Kyle Bennett refused to continue participating, saying that his mana was depleted, and in the continuing battles, the Twilight Guild lost 3-2, and the Sun Festival came to an end, and reporters reported that this time, neither Twilight nor Dawn could capture the Sun Festival, but the Martial Arts Guild unexpectedly took first place. Kyle Bennett became a star among the hunters, and the discussion about his level continued on social media, and people assumed that his level was above 60 and wondered where he came from, how strong he was if he was a newbie, and considered him a secret weapon of Dawn, assuming that he was stronger than both the head of Twilight and the head of Dawn, and the prestige of the Twilight Guild dropped significantly. Paxville's secretary stood frozen in front of his office, fearing him and at the same time worrying about him. Sam plucked up the courage to ask if Max was okay, but only strange sounds from behind the closed door of the office were his answer. The head of Twilight himself sat in the middle of the office, destroyed in rage and laughter. He experienced a whole storm of feelings, noting that what happened was funny. He remembered what he had experienced at the Sun Festival, when he had felt Bennett's enormous power, but in addition to the fear he had experienced then, his guild had also been ridiculed. Yes, Paxville had felt Kyle's power for just a moment, but it wasn't at a level Max could handle, assuming Bennett was implying that the head of Twilight was no match for him. Guildmaster Twilight put on his jacket, agreeing and acknowledging the fact that Kyle was stronger and that it was not Paxville who would be able to defeat Bennett now. But this state of affairs, on the contrary, gave the head of the Twilight Guild the opportunity not to hide his means and methods. Paxville left the office and was immediately met in the foyer by Sam. When the secretary asked where he was going, Paxville chuckled, saying that he was going to see the Heavenly Warrior,